Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving straight into a truly powerful piece of sociological writing by Agnes Jung called Lost Spring: Stories of Stolen Childhood. And instead of just throwing dry statistics at you, we're going to take a distinctly narrative approach. We're stepping directly into the lived experiences of two different children to really expose the grinding traditions that condemn this massive, totally invisible workforce to a lifetime of exploitation.
I want to ground us right away in this reality. Sometimes I find a rupee in the garbage. Try to imagine saying that, but with a genuine spark of hope in your eyes. This is how we meet a young boy named Saheb. For him, a sprawling, foul-smelling garbage dump isn't some wasteland. No, it's literally a landscape of hope. It's survival, and it's a daily treasure hunt happening right on the edges of modern prosperity.
But before we follow Saheb any further, we really need to understand the metaphor at the heart of all this. What exactly is a lost spring? Well, think about it. Spring is universally known as the season of renewal, joy, things blooming. It represents childhood. So a lost spring means the absolute theft of that childhood innocence. It's a complete systemic failure that traps kids in a perpetual state of poverty, labor, and exploitation, completely robbing them of the education and growth that should naturally define those early years.
You can almost feel the restless energy of Saheb and his friends. They roam the streets barefoot, showing up like a flock of morning birds and then just disappearing by noon. Their home is Simapuri, which is a squatter settlement right on the absolute periphery of Delhi. Saheb family actually came here as refugees from Bangladesh back in 1971 after their green fields and homes were swept away by storms. And now, they live in this metropolitan wilderness where scouring through garbage is, for all intents and purposes, their only industry.
10,000. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the staggering number of rag pickers living in Simapuri. They're living in mud structures, roofs made of tin and tarpaulin. There's no sewage, no drainage, no running water. And here is a totally shocking reality. For over 30 years, these 10,000 individuals have existed without permits or official identities. I mean, they do have ration cards that get them on voters' lists so they can buy grain, because as the source material explicitly points out, food is far more important for basic survival than an identity ever could be.
And this bizarre existence creates this fascinating but really tragic psychological contrast. Garbage literally holds two completely different meanings depending on how old you are. For the parents, the elders, rag picking is strictly their daily bread. It's the leaking roof over their heads, their only means of survival. But for the kids, for Saheb, it's wrapped in wonder. Because hey, when you might just find a silver coin in a heap of trash, you don't stop scrounging. There's always that tantalizing hope that you're going to find more.
Which brings us to a highly poignant detail. When someone asks these boys why they aren't wearing footwear, the answers are incredibly revealing. One kid says his mother didn't bring them down from the shelf. Another is wearing mismatched shoes. A third simply says, "I want shoes." It's this common societal excuse, right? To say that staying barefoot is merely a tradition. But is it actually a tradition, or is it just a really convenient lie to explain away a perpetual state of poverty? For a child who has walked barefoot his entire life, finding even a discarded tennis shoe with a hole in it is literally a dream come true.
As time moves on, Saheb's life shifts. He actually trades that light plastic scavenging bag for a heavy steel canister. He gets a regular job at a tea stall down the road. But you can see the metaphorical weight of it. That carefree look, it's totally vanished.
So the crucial point boils down to this devastating realization. Saheb is no longer his own master. Sure, he's being paid 800 rupees and gets all his meals, which on paper sounds like a total upgrade in the economics of survival. But the tragic irony is that the plastic bag was his own. That heavy steel canister belongs to the man who owns the tea shop. For 800 rupees, Saheb has effectively traded away the absolute last remaining shred of his childhood freedom for grueling subordinate labor.
Okay, let's pivot our narrative focus here. We are leaving the squatter settlements of Simapuri and heading to the claustrophobic, dust-choked streets of Firozabad. Now, Firozabad is famously the center of India's glassblowing industry. It's the kind of town where it seems like every other family has spent generations working around roaring furnaces, welding glass, and making bangles for women all over the country.
And this is where we meet our second focal point, a young boy named Mukesh. His reality in Firozabad is grim. Families sit in these dingy cells, dark hutments lit by flickering oil lamps, welding pieces of colored glass into circles of bangles. Their eyes actually become more adjusted to the dark than to the light outside. It's this primeval state of coexistence with extreme heat and toxic dust.
And just like in Simapuri, the scale here is absolutely terrifying. 20,000. That is the estimated number of children illegally working in these blistering hot glass furnaces. They slog through their daylight hours in these unventilated, high-temperature rooms. And because of the conditions and that constant focus in dim light, a lot of these 20,000 children will end up losing their eyesight completely before they even reach adulthood.
It sets up this brutal, sheer paradox. We meet a young girl named Savita, soldering glass with hands moving mechanically, almost like a machine. She's making bangles, which are these beautiful symbols of an Indian woman's suhag, auspiciousness in marriage. Yet the young girls creating these vibrant symbols of joy and celebration are trapped in a bleak, colorless existence, slowly going blind in the process. They are quite literally manufacturing cultural beauty at the cost of their own sight and their own future.
Now, you might be asking yourself, why don't they just leave? The answer lies in a really deep psychological trap, the concept of karma, or destiny. It is a suffocating weight of caste and tradition. Because they are born into the caste of bangle makers, they believe they are destined to do nothing but make bangles. The suffering isn't just normalized, it is accepted as an unchangeable law of the universe.
Mukesh's grandmother perfectly captures this exact mindset. She literally watches her own husband go blind from the dust of polishing glass, and her response is this haunting question: can a God-given lineage ever be broken? The older generation has entirely internalized their own exploitation. They view these horrific working conditions in absolute poverty not as a systemic failure of society, but as divine will. I mean, when you believe God has assigned you to the furnace, how do you even begin to rebel against that?
To ground this abstract concept of poverty into a visceral, undeniable reality, Jung shares this heartbreaking quote from an older woman sitting beside Savita. She says, in a voice completely drained of joy, "Ek waqt sir bhar khana bhi nahi khaya," which translates to, she has not enjoyed even one full meal in her entire lifetime. A lifetime of labor, of making bangles, of sacrificing her eyesight, and the only thing she has to show for it is perpetual hunger. Even her husband admits he knows nothing else except making bangles and managing to build a crumbling house.
Let's break down the actual systemic machinery of this exploitation. Why can't these young men just organize a cooperative or dream their way out of the slums? Well, first, years of mind-numbing toil have simply killed all initiative and the physical ability to even dream. Second, they're trapped in a vicious circle of middlemen who trapped their fathers and forefathers before them. Third, there's that unyielding weight of caste stigma. And finally, there's a total lack of cooperative organization. Why? Because as the young men tell Jung, even if they do organize, they are the ones who will be hauled up by the police, beaten and dragged to jail for doing something illegal. There is no leader among them to help them see things differently.
Yet amidst all this crushing despair, we circle back to Mukesh. Mukesh absolutely insists on being his own master. He tells the author, "I will be a motor mechanic." And when she asks if he knows anything about cars, he looks her straight in the eye and says, "I will learn to drive a car." His dream looms like a mirage in the dust of Firozabad, but it represents the sheer, stubborn resilience of youth. It is this tiny, rebellious spark against the immense machinery of his so-called destiny.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a profound question drawn directly from our analysis of these sources. We've seen the stolen freedom of Sahib and the dangerous, sight-destroying furnaces trapping Mukesh. It really forces us to ask, why must child labor be eliminated? And practically speaking, how can a supposedly God-given lineage of poverty ever truly be broken? Think about that vicious cycle of middlemen, apathy, and systemic traps we just mapped out. How do you dismantle a cage that the prisoners have been taught was built by destiny? It's a powerful thought to carry with you. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the big questions.
Welcome to the Explainer. All right, let's just dive right into this highly emotional and frankly beautifully structured poem by Kamala Das titled My Mother at 66. Today we're going to unpack a piece of literature that is essentially a single-breath journey. We are going to explore how a seemingly ordinary, everyday car ride to an airport transforms into this profound meditation on aging, mortality, and that terrifying realization that the people we love most simply won't be around forever.
You know, to ground ourselves before we really get into the text, take a look at this central question drawn directly from our source material. Aging is a natural process. Have you ever thought what our elderly parents expect from us? It's a heavy question, right? It taps right into a deeply universal human experience and a very specific, deeply rooted childhood fear for a lot of us. We all absolutely know that aging is inevitable, but confronting it face to face, especially when it's your own parent, well, that's an entirely different emotional reality. And this is exactly the emotional threshold we're crossing with the poet today.
Section 1. Meet Kamala Das. Capturing complex relationships.
To really get the weight of this poem, we first need to understand the unique lens of the person who actually wrote it. Kamala Das, who lived from 1934-2009, was born in Malabar, Kerala, and she's widely recognized as one of India's foremost poets. What makes her work so incredibly compelling is her originality and this authentic, indigenous flavor of the soil that she brings to her writing. She actually published many novels and short stories in both English and Malayalam under the pen name Madhavakuti, but her true mastery, that lies in her sensitivity. She just has this incredible ability to capture the complex, often really painful subtleties of human relationships in a lyrical idiom. My Mother at 66 is arguably one of the greatest examples of her bringing that deeply personal sensitivity right to the page.
Section 2. The Car Ride Realization. A Friday Morning to Cochin.
So, let's set the scene here. A physical journey, just driving to the Cochin airport, instantly becomes this intense, internal, emotional journey. The poem opens with a super mundane activity. The poet is driving from her parents' home on a Friday morning. But then she glances over. I saw my mother, beside me, doze, open-mouthed, her face ashen like that of a corpse. Man, that is a jarring, heartbreaking moment. She looks at her mother sleeping, and suddenly the mother's face looks completely drained of color, ashen. The deliberate use of the word corpse brings the absolute, terrifying finality of death right into the passenger seat of the car. It's that sudden, painful realization literally hitting her all at once that her mother is exactly as old and as fragile as she looks.
Which brings us to Section 3. Life outside the window. Escaping the pain. I mean, human nature dictates that when a thought is just too painful to bear, we immediately look for a distraction. And that's exactly what our poet does. To push that devastating thought of her mother's mortality away, she looks out the car window. And what does she observe in the real world? She sees young trees sprinting and merry children spilling out of their homes. Think about it. Inside the car, we have total stillness, aging, and the very real shadow of death. But outside, we have the ultimate symbols of vitality, trees that appear to be sprinting past the moving car, representing the rapid, unstoppable passage of time. Children brimming with energy, spilling joyously out of their homes. It's a masterful, highly visual juxtaposition between the fading life beside her and the fast-paced, vibrant life rushing by outside.
Section 4. A Late Winter's Moon. The Airport Security Check.
The car ride eventually ends, and as they arrive at the airport, boom, that brief, comforting distraction fades away, and harsh reality sets right back in. The poet has passed through the airport's security check. She's now standing a few yards away, physically separated from her mother, and she looks back at her one more time. This physical distance of just a few yards suddenly feels like a massive gulf, a haunting foreshadowing of the ultimate, permanent separation that is to come.
This is where the poet makes a really crucial visual comparison. We just talked about the lively, colorful imagery of those merry children. Now, looking back at her mother from a distance, she describes her face as wan, pale as a late winter's moon. I want you to picture a late winter's moon. It lacks brightness, it's hazy, it's at the very end of its cycle, completely devoid of the warmth and energy of youth. This colorless, fading image marks the exact moment that the poet's old, familiar ache, her deepest childhood fear of losing her mother, comes rushing back in full force.
And that leads us to Section 5, A Mask of Smiles, the childhood fear returns. Now we reach the final emotional crescendo of the piece. And did you catch this? Fascinatingly, the entire poem is a single sentence, punctuated only by commas. No way, right? But it brilliantly illustrates the structural genius of Kamala Das's work. The poem isn't broken up into neat, tidy stanzas with periods. It indicates a single, unbroken thread of thought. It is literally poured out in one continuous, anxious, breathless stream of consciousness. The observations of the real world, the trees, the children, are simply interspersed into this single, overwhelming main idea of her mother's aging. So, how does this massive, breathless sentence actually end? Despite the suffocating fear of the late winter's moon, all she manages to say is, "See you soon, Amma." And all she does is smile and smile and smile. There is such a profound tragedy in this repetition. The words are optimistic, promising a future meeting, but the physical act, the repeated,
Desperate smiling is a deliberate facade. It's a mask she forces onto her face to hide the agonizing pain and the ache of her childhood fear from her mother.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today and leaves us with this final provocative thought to consider. What do the parting words of the poet and that repetitive smile truly signify? We've seen throughout this explainer how Kamala Das brilliantly uses contrast, youth versus age, life versus death, inner turmoil versus outer calm. Her parting words and her lingering smile are the ultimate emotional armor. They force us to reflect on the brave faces we all put on, the facades we build to protect our loved ones, and frankly, to protect ourselves from the inevitable pain of letting go. It's a single sentence, but it echoes with a lifetime of love and fear. I highly encourage you to try a little experiment. Read the poem through again, out loud in one single breath, with this continuous journey in mind. It completely changes the experience. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.
All right, let's jump right into today's explainer. We're looking at a classic short story by Alphonse Daudet called The Last Lesson, and we're going to use this story to really unpack how history violently shapes our everyday lives and our cultural identities. You know, we so often think of history as this abstract thing, right? Something that happens on battlefields to generals and politicians. But Daudet's story, it forces us to see how massive geopolitical shifts can literally rewrite the daily realities of completely ordinary people overnight.
So before we even get into the plot itself, I want you to think about something. Consider the immense, crushing psychological weight of having your own language suddenly outlawed. Just imagine waking up one day and being told that the words you use to think, to speak to your family, to make sense of your world, they're simply no longer allowed in your schools or public spaces. This is the exact jarring scenario our source material drops us into, and it sets the stage for a really masterful look at linguistic identity.
Now, historically, this story is anchored right in the middle of the Franco-Prussian War, spanning from 1870 to 1871. If you look at the northeast regions of France, specifically Alsace and Lorraine, you can see where this conflict truly hit home. France was under attack and ultimately defeated by Prussia under Bismarck's leadership. Because of that devastating loss, these two French districts passed directly into Prussian hands. Just like that, the borders shifted, and the people living there woke up subjugated to a totally new foreign authority.
But here's the thing. Our story doesn't start with those generals or those changing borders. It actually starts with a super relatable image of a young boy named Franz. He's hurrying to school late on a bright, warm morning, and he is absolutely dreading it. Why? Because his teacher, Monsieur Hamel, is going to quiz the class on participles, and Franz doesn't know the first thing about them. He's literally considering just running away to spend the day outside, listening to the birds or watching the Prussian soldiers drilling in the fields. It's this completely normal, innocent kid's perspective on what is about to be a truly devastating day.
When Franz finally gets to school, he's met with a massive contrast to his normal routine. Usually, school mornings are full of this huge bustle. You can hear it all the way out in the street. You know, the opening and closing of desks, kids loudly repeating lessons in unison with their hands over their ears, the teacher's heavy ruler rapping on the table. Franz was actually counting on all that commotion to sneak into his seat unnoticed. But today is totally different. He walks in, and the room is as quiet and solemn as a Sunday morning. Everyone's already seated, and his strict teacher, instead of yelling at him, just gently tells him to go to his place.
The reason for this eerie, unsettling silence becomes crystal clear when Monsieur Hamel steps up to his chair. In this very grave, gentle tone, he announces that a new order has come down from Berlin. Starting tomorrow, only German will be taught in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine. A new master is arriving. This is their final French lesson. When Franz hears this, he is absolutely floored. He describes the realization as a thunderclap. It's that exact heartbreaking moment where the abstract reality of a lost war suddenly crashes right down into his very real, very personal world. All that bad news he'd seen people reading on the town bulletin board, it finally makes terrible sense.
So, the crucial takeaway here is how this sudden, shocking loss instantly changes everyone's perspective. The text beautifully captures this heavy weight of shared regret. Suddenly, Franz's heavy, annoying books, his grammar book, his History of the Saints, they feel like old friends he just can't bear to lose. But Monsieur Hamel points out that Franz isn't the only one to blame for skipping studying to go slide on the ice or hunt for birds' eggs. The parents share the blame too, for sending their kids to work on farms or in the mills just to earn a few extra pennies. And, incredibly poignantly, Monsieur Hamel blames himself. He admits he used to give the students the day off when he wanted to go fishing or had them water his garden instead of studying. It's this powerful collective realization of a precious culture they totally took for granted, until it was snatched away.
And that shared regret,
That's exactly why the normally empty back benches of the classroom are packed with village elders. Old Hauser is back there in his three-cornered hat, holding an old, worn-out primer. The former mayor is there, the old postmaster too. They're all just sitting quietly, looking incredibly sad. As Franz realizes, they are there to honor Monsieur Hamel's 40 years of faithful service. But even more than that, it's their way of mourning. It's a show of deep respect for a country that is simply theirs no more. Think about it, they're adults attending a children's school because they are profoundly sorry they didn't go more when they had the chance.
During this deeply emotional final class, Monsieur Hamel pivots from regular grammar to a passionate, full-throated defense of the French language itself. He begs his students and the villagers to guard their native tongue and never ever forget it. He talks about French with this immense reverence, calling it the most beautiful language in the world, the clearest, and the most logical. In this heartbreaking moment, he isn't just teaching a language, he's elevating their everyday speech into a sacred cultural artifact, something that literally must be protected at all costs, even if they have to do it in secret.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core thesis of the story. Monsieur Hamel tells them that when a people are enslaved, as long as they hold fast to their language, it is as if they had the key to their prison. This is absolutely crucial. Language here isn't just a tool for talking to your neighbor. It is the ultimate vehicle for cultural survival. It represents an internal, untouchable freedom that an occupying force cannot easily take away. Holding on to it, that is the purest act of resistance against total assimilation. The text then gives us this incredibly quiet yet powerful moment. The students are diligently practicing writing France Alsace over and over, their papers looking like little flags floating all around the room. And young Franz hears pigeons cooing softly on the roof. Hearing this, he asks himself a profound question. Will they make them sing in German, even the pigeons? This childlike wonder is amazing because it highlights the sheer absurdity of the conquerors. It points out the absolute limits of an oppressor trying to force a brand new identity onto a people. You can change the laws, sure, you can redraw the borders on a map, but you cannot legislate nature. You simply cannot erase the organic, natural identity of a community that easily.
Let's zoom out for a second, because this localized moment with Franz actually builds into a much broader concept called linguistic chauvinism. Basically, this is an exaggerated pride in one's own language, which usually results in forcing it onto minority groups or conquered peoples. By outlawing French and mandating German, the Prussian authorities in the story are exercising extreme linguistic chauvinism. They aren't just taking the physical land, they are actively trying to dismantle the cultural heritage of Alsace and Lorraine. They want to force them into a new, uniform identity, literally stripping away their history word by word.
The pacing of the story then builds to an inevitable, crushing conclusion as those final moments tick away. Even the babies chanting their letters and old Hauser spelling right along with them through his tears. It all has to end. All at once, the church clock strikes 12, followed immediately by the Angelus. At that exact moment, the tension just snaps. The trumpets of the returning Prussian soldiers ring out loud and clear, right under the school windows. This sound is the ultimate signal. It marks the official, irreversible end of their French education, and the stark, cold beginning of their new reality as a conquered people.
In the very final moments of the story, Monsieur Hamel stands up. Franz notes that his teacher is incredibly pale, and yet has never looked so tall. He tries to speak to his friends, but he's so choked with emotion that he just can't get the words out. So instead, he turns to the blackboard, grabs a piece of chalk, and bearing down with all his might, he writes as large as he can, "Vive la France! Long live France!" Then, without saying a single word, he leans his head against the wall and just gestures with his hand that school is dismissed. It is a completely heartbreaking, yet utterly defiant final act.
Now, Dade's story might be set in the 1870s, but it leaves us with a challenge that is incredibly relevant today. We still see linguistic minorities navigating these immense pressures in modern states all over the world, which leaves us with a powerful, enduring question to ponder. When identity is threatened, whether that's by law or just the slow creep of dominant cultures, how do communities today find the strength to keep the key to their prison? How do they make sure their own pigeons aren't forced to sing a different song? Think about that, and we'll catch you next time.
Okay, let's just dive right into one of the most profound historical questions out there when it comes to power and resistance. How do you actually defeat an entrenched, highly resourced empire without raising a single weapon? I mean, it sounds almost impossible, right?
Well, rather than looking to magic or myth, we are going to break down the exact strategic mechanics Mahatma Gandhi used back in 1917.
Because, as you'll see, this wasn't just a protest. It was a highly pragmatic blueprint for civil disobedience. It actually operated almost like a brilliant psychological heist, fundamentally altering the mindset of an entire nation.
Welcome to our explainer on the Champaran campaign. Today, we're going to unpack the absolute anatomy of a successful social movement. We'll see exactly how methodical data gathering, calculated defiance, and a shockingly strategic compromise brought a massive, powerful system to a complete standstill.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the resolute peasant, the indigo trap, defying the empire, freedom from fear, the strategic compromise, and finally, rebuilding Champaran.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the resolute peasant, the power of tenacity.
So every great movement needs a spark, right? Here, that spark was an illiterate sharecropper named Rajkumar Shukla. And this guy possessed a genuine superpower, absolute unrelenting stubbornness. He approaches Gandhi in December 1916 and essentially just refuses to leave him alone. He follows Gandhi to Kanpur, tracks him all the way back to his ashram, and literally sits on his haunches in Calcutta for months, just waiting. Until finally, Gandhi surrendered, agreed to a date, and traveled with him to Bihar. It's kind of crazy when you think about it, but the irony here is just incredible. When the future Mahatma arrived in Patna at the home of a prominent lawyer, the deeply ingrained prejudices of the time were on full display. The servants wouldn't even let him draw water from the well. They were terrified that drops from his bucket might pollute their water source. To them, he wasn't a great leader yet. He was just another untouchable peasant.
Moving right along to Section 2, the indigo trap, the mechanics of exploitation.
Now, we have to understand the core problem here. This wasn't just some abstract political disagreement. It was a system of absolute economic ruin. Under a long-term contract, peasants were forced to plant 15% of their land with indigo and surrender that entire harvest as rent to their British landlords. But then, a massive tech disruption happens. Germany develops synthetic indigo. Suddenly, natural indigo is commercially worthless. So did the landlords just let the peasants out of the contract? Nope. They deceitfully demanded massive financial compensation to release the peasants from an arrangement that was already totally useless to the landlords anyway.
The stakes here were absolutely massive in this true David versus Goliath scenario. If these illiterate sharecroppers tried to resist, they had to somehow navigate a complex, highly stacked legal system. And the landlords? Well, they just hired thugs to inflict direct physical violence and intimidation.
Let's look at how Gandhi handled this in Section 3, Define the Empire, Information as a Weapon.
Before taking any dramatic action, Gandhi began a highly methodical process. You really need to think of him less as a traditional spiritual leader here, and more like a top-tier detective building a totally foolproof case. Information, not violence, was his primary weapon. He goes right to the British Landlords Association and the commissioner. He gets bullied and told to leave, but he completely ignores them. Hearing a peasant was maltreated, he actually rides out to the crime scene on the back of an elephant to investigate. And when the police serve him with an official notice to quit Champaran immediately, he calmly signs the receipt and writes directly on it that he is going to disobey the order.
This is where his calculated defiance forces a legal showdown. In court, Gandhi perfectly articulates his philosophy. By pleading guilty, he stated he was torn between not setting a bad example as a lawbreaker and his ultimate duty to render humanitarian service. Then, he refuses to pay bail. This completely baffles the magistrate and brilliantly shifts the entire moral weight onto the government's shoulders.
Which brings us to the climax in Section 4, freedom from fear, the turning point.
The real victory of Champaran? It didn't happen inside that courtroom. When morning came, the town of Motihari was literally black with peasants. Thousands upon thousands arrived in this massive, spontaneous demonstration. They had merely heard that a Mahatma who wanted to help them was in trouble. The British officials felt so utterly powerless against this human tide that they actually had to rely on Gandhi's help just to regulate the crowd. This moment right here marked the absolute beginning of their liberation from fear. And the dominoes kept falling. Even the local elite lawyers were completely transformed by this. Initially, these prominent lawyers admitted that if Gandhi went to jail, they'd probably just pack up and go home. But Gandhi's unwavering commitment shamed them. They realized it would be a shameful desertion to abandon their own people while a total stranger went to prison for them. So, moving from self-preservation to absolute solidarity, they came back and agreed to court arrest right alongside him.
When those lawyers agreed to go to jail, Gandhi knew the real war, the psychological one, was victorious. He declared, "The Battle of Champaran is won." And he was right.
This unified, fearless front so thoroughly baffled the government that a few days later, the lieutenant governor ordered the case against Gandhi to be dropped entirely.
Okay, Section 5, the Strategic Compromise, Breaking the Deadlock.
So following an official inquiry that assembled a crushing mountain of evidence against the planters, it was time to talk financial restitution. The planters fully expected Gandhi to demand a 100% repayment of the extorted money.
But to their total surprise, Gandhi only asks for a 50% refund. Thinking he wouldn't budge any further, the planters countered with a really lowball offer of just 25%. And then Gandhi amazes everyone by immediately taking them at their word. Boom, deal done, deadlock broken. Now why on earth accept just 25%? Well, because Gandhi knew the actual cash was completely secondary. By forcing the landlords to surrender even a portion of the money, they were surrendering their prestige. They destroyed their own untouchable image. The peasants suddenly saw they had rights, they learned courage, and guess what? Within a few years, the planters completely abandoned their estates.
And finally, Section 6, Rebuilding Champaran, going beyond political solutions. You see, our explainer doesn't just end with a legal win, because true liberation requires social upliftment. Gandhi immediately addressed the cultural and health backwardness of the villages. He appealed for volunteer teachers and secured a doctor for 6 months. Armed with literally just 3 basic medicines, castor oil, quinine, and sulfur ointment, he combated miserable health conditions. It proved his leadership was about holistic community building, not just extracting political wins and walking away. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to try applying this way of thinking to your own life. How can you apply this principle of freedom from fear in your modern struggles? Try using these exact strategic mechanics, relentless data gathering, creating absolute unity, and engaging in fearless, ego-free compromise to challenge the entrenched Goliaths in your world today. It's a highly practical toolkit. Thank you for diving into the mechanics of change with me. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.
Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to slow things down. We're looking at a profoundly beautiful piece of writing by Pablo Neruda. That's the pen name of Neftali Ricardo Reyes Basualto, by the way, the Chilean writer who snagged the Nobel Prize for Literature back in 1971. In a world that's constantly moving and literally always demanding our attention, Neruda's work invites us to explore the absolute necessity of quiet introspection. So take a deep breath, settle in. We're going to unpack how a simple moment of stillness might just be the ultimate key to creating a real feeling of mutual understanding among all human beings. Okay, let's dive into this. Neruda starts off with a brilliantly simple request. Let's stop for 1 second and not move our arms so much. Actually, I want you to literally do that right now with me as we go through this. Just pause your physical momentum. We're skipping any complex agendas today, we're just pausing. Neruda's asking us to do something that honestly feels incredibly strange in our hyper-connected modern lives, which is to just stop. For once, on the face of the earth, he suggests we don't speak in any language. We just completely halt our physical actions. It's this sudden, jarring halt to literally everything we're so used to doing day in and day out. Think about your typical day for a second. It's probably this constant, rushing blur of schedules, endless notifications buzzing, engines roaring, just a perpetual forward motion that never seems to give us a single exotic moment without the rush, without the deafening noise of machinery. We're just always running. But what if we just stopped? Quote, "Now we will count to 12, and we will all keep still." End quote. In that sudden strangeness, we would all be together. It's a collective pause, a really powerful moment where the noise just fades away and we're left with a shared silence.
So if we actually manage to pull off this collective pause, the source material gives us some absolutely incredible examples of what would happen. Basically, if we abandon our single-minded rush, the chain of harm just stops. Fishermen out in the cold sea would temporarily cease their hunt, which means they wouldn't harm the whales. The man gathering salt, someone stuck in this agonizing, repetitive labor, would finally have a second to actually look at his own hurt hands. And perhaps most impactfully, those who are perpetually preparing for conflicts, what the poem refers to as green wars, wars with gas, wars with fire, victories where there are no survivors. They'd stop their preparations. They would put on clean clothes. The whole cycle of environmental destruction, self-injury, and global conflict, all of that requires constant motion. Stillness completely interrupts that motion. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what Neruda visualizes as the alternative to all that chaos. I mean, imagine people join hand in hand across the globe.
Instead of plotting these catastrophic wars with no survivors, people would put on those clean clothes and just walk about with their brothers in the shade. They would be doing nothing. And it's really important to note that in this context, doing nothing isn't laziness at all. It's a profound state of peace. It's this shared unity where mutual understanding completely replaces all the hostility and division.
Now, Neruda points out a deeply specific aspect of all this, a contrast that causes us immense suffering. We suffer from a very specific kind of sadness. It's the sadness of never understanding ourselves and of constantly threatening ourselves with death purely because we're so incredibly single-minded about keeping our lives moving. We just never stop to reflect. But the alternative? The alternative is the interruption of a huge silence. If we could just for once do nothing, that huge silence might finally interrupt our tragic, perpetual misunderstanding of who we actually are.
So, the crucial point is distinguishing between stillness and death. The poet is very, very clear about this. What I want should not be confused with total inactivity. He says, life is what it is about. Then he uses this very specific, kind of old-school phrase. He wants no truck with death. To have no truck with something basically means to absolutely refuse to associate with it, or to refuse to tolerate it. Neruda isn't advocating for giving up on life or just embracing total inactivity, because that equates to death. No, he's asking us to refuse to associate with mindless, harmful momentum.
To really wrap our heads around this narrative, we can look straight to nature. Think of a human form branching out like a tree, deeply rooted in the ground. The poem suggests perhaps the earth can teach us. Think about the earth during winter. On the surface, everything seems completely dead, perfectly still, frozen in inactivity, right? But beneath that apparent stillness, life is quietly preparing. It's resting, it's regenerating, and later, it proves to be vibrantly alive. The earth teaches us that profound life and growth don't always require loud, visible motion. Sometimes, the absolute most important development happens under the cover of complete quiet.
Let's move to and see how this builds into some actual things to try right now. Our source material gives us a direct challenge. Step 1, choose a quiet corner. Step 2, keep still, both physically and mentally, for about 5 minutes. Step 3, notice any change in your state of mind. I challenge you to treat this as a guided meditation later today. Disconnect from the engines and the rush. Embrace that sudden strangeness we talked about. Just see if that huge silence interrupts the noise in your own life.
We're going to end this explainer with a question taken straight from our source text, and it's one that I really want to leave lingering in your mind. What will counting up to 12 and keeping still help us achieve? Think about the whales, the salt gatherer, the brothers walking in the shade, and the earth that seems so dead but is actually vibrantly alive. Reflect on all of that as you find your own quiet corner today. And with that thought, I'll echo the poet's final promise to you. Now I'll count up to 12, and you keep quiet, and I will go.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're bringing some serious energy to a truly fascinating piece of literature. We're looking at A.R. Barton's short story, Going Places. Now on the surface, this might just look like a simple tale from a textbook, but it's actually an absolute masterclass in understanding the psychology of celebrity obsession, adolescent fantasizing, and, well, family dynamics. We're going to take a deeply narrative approach today, visualizing exactly how a seemingly harmless daydream can build a massive wall between us and reality.
So I want you to really think about this for a second. Have you ever idolized a celebrity just to escape your own reality? We're exploring a deeply universal human flaw here, that totally relatable urge to dream just a bit too big in order to escape a grim, everyday routine. Whether it's musicians, actors, or athletes, we've all looked at someone else's glamorous life and wished, even for a split second, that we could just step right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First, escaping the biscuit factory. Second, the anatomy of a fantasy. Third, the heavy burden of sadness. Fourth, analyzing the author's toolkit. And finally, your turn, spot the theme.
Starting with Section 1, Escaping the Biscuit Factory, the clash of working-class reality and high-fashion dreams.
To really understand the friction in this story, we've got to set the scene. The environment our characters live in is gritty, practical, and honestly completely devoid of glamour. Enter our protagonist, Sophie. She's a teenager who is utterly lost in wistful daydreams. When she finishes school, she doesn't just want a job, she wants a boutique. But not just any boutique. She tells her friend she's going to be a manager. Or actually, scratch that, maybe an actress because there's real money in that. Or perhaps even a fashion designer, just like the iconic Mary Quant. Her ambitions are incredibly grand, soaring way above the actual city she lives in.
And this stark contrast brilliantly illustrates the core conflict of her life. You've got Sophie's ethereal dreams of being a boutique owner, an actress, or a fashion designer on one hand, but her inescapable working-class reality paints a very, very different picture. She and her pragmatic friend Janzi are basically already earmarked for the local biscuit factory. Sophie goes home to a small, steamy room, dirty washing piled up in the corner, and a father whose plump face is still grimy and sweat-marked from a hard day's labor. The contrast is jarring, and it perfectly explains why her mind is so desperate to construct a beautiful escape hatch.
Which brings us to Section 2, the anatomy of a fantasy. Constructing an escape hatch.
To understand how someone actually builds that escape hatch, we have to look at the people around Sophie, because they inadvertently push her deeper into her own delusion. Her friend Jancy is pragmatic and doubtful. She knows they're factory-bound and tells Sophie to just be sensible. Then there's her dad, who is openly disdainful. When she mentions money, he aggressively shoots her down, completely grounded in their harsh economic reality. But then, you have her older brother, Jeff. Jeff is an apprentice mechanic, and he's a guy of very few words. Words literally have to be prized out of him like stones out of the ground. Because he is silent and skeptical, his unexpressed life becomes this fascinating blank canvas for Sophie. She imagines him out in a vast, exotic world, and she desperately wants him to take her along.
Because her immediate circle offers absolutely no glamorous escape, Sophie latches onto a symbol of everything she wants, the innocent genius Danny Casey. Casey is a young Irish football prodigy playing for United. He's talented, he's famous, and in Sophie's mind, he's the ultimate ticket out of her mundane existence. He isn't just a player on a pitch. To her, he represents pure magic.
But Sophie doesn't just admire him from afar. She invents a highly specific three-step narrative to convince her brother Jeff that she actually met him. First, she claims a chance meeting outside a clothing store called Royce's. Second, she adds a relatable, realistic little detail. She asked for an autograph for her little brother Derek, but neither of them had a pen. Third, and definitely most dangerously, she claims they bonded over feeling lonely and he promised her a secret date the following week. She constructs this step-by-step fantasy solely to win Jeff's attention and get some sort of validation that she is special. Moving right along to Section 3, the heavy burden of sadness, when the illusion breaks.
Because fantasies, no matter how well constructed, always have an expiration date. As she sits by a solitary elm tree waiting for a date she entirely fabricated, reality finally crushes her. Now I have become sad, she thought, and it is a hard burden to carry, this sadness. She realizes he is never going to come. She knows her family's going to doubt her, just like they always have. But the true tragedy here, even when faced with the painful truth of her own delusion, she chooses to retreat back into the fantasy in her mind rather than accept her reality.
This takes us to Section 4, analyzing the author's toolkit, working with words and noticing form.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how A.R. Barton actually built this world. We've talked about the narrative, but the source material here functions as a literal English-language textbook, using this rich story to teach grammar and form. The way the story is written is just as important as what happens in it. Barton uses very specific linguistic tools to make Sophie's world feel incredibly authentic.
For example, look at the colloquialisms. Take the word chuffed, which is teenage slang meaning delighted or very pleased, or words like gawky and nosy. By peppering the dialogue with these informal localized slang terms, Barton grounds the characters. Despite Sophie's lofty head-in-the-clouds daydreaming, the language anchors the story in a highly specific, informal reality that we can instantly relate to.
Barton also uses grammar to create a sense of simultaneous action. Take this sentence structure. When I leave, Sophie said, coming home from school, I'm gonna have a boutique. The author uses the present participle, coming, to show two things happening at exactly the same time. You, as the reader, are experiencing Sophie's mundane external action of coming home from school at the exact same moment you're experiencing her internal dreaming about the boutique. It's just a brilliant, subtle way to reinforce that constant clash between her physical reality and her mental fantasy.
Let's wrap up with Section 5, your turn. Spot the theme, applying the lesson.
Okay, I'm handing the baton over to you to try spotting this theme in the real world. I challenge you to look for other stories, movies, or documentaries centered on hero worship. Identify characters who use sports or film icons to escape their lives. Try to analyze the socioeconomic friction, the lack of money, the tough jobs, driving that fantasy. And pay close attention to exactly how and when their reality and delusion conflict. It's like a mental workout for media literacy.
So, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Which pop culture icon do you plan to analyze first?
We live in an era of intense stan culture, where people routinely lose themselves in the lives of online influencers, musicians, and athletes. You now have the analytical tools to understand the psychology behind it. Use them. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the stories around you.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving right in to a profoundly moving story by the incredible Swedish writer Selma Lagerlöf. Now, her work almost always revolves around this one singular, absolutely powerful theme: the idea that essential human goodness can actually be awakened through understanding. And to really grasp this, we're going to take a narrative approach today. Let's start exactly where she does, with that classic fairy tale opening. Once upon a time, there was a man who went around selling small rat traps made of wire. He was a weary vagabond, dressed in literal rags, with sunken cheeks, and you could just see the hunger gleaming in his eyes. He made these traps himself at odd moments, using wire he'd begged for in stores or at large farms, basically just trying to keep body and soul together.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this isn't just a simple story about a poor man selling wire traps. It's actually a deep philosophical exploration. I mean, imagine the sad, monotonous life of a vagabond, left entirely to his own lonely thoughts, as he just plods along the dirt roads day after day. Well, one day he has this massive epiphany. A deeply cynical, yet kind of entertaining thought strikes him. What if the whole world, with all its lands and seas, its cities and villages, what if it's literally nothing but a giant rat trap? What if the universe is fundamentally entirely designed just to snare us?
Section 1. The World as a Rat Trap. A cynical philosophy. And this brilliantly illustrates the core of his entire philosophy. Really think about how a physical rat trap works. It's a highly visual style of thinking. You place a piece of cheese or a bit of pork inside to tempt the rat, right? Well, according to our vagabond, the world operates on that exact same mechanism. You see, the world had never, ever been kind to him, so he actually found this weird, twisted joy in thinking ill of it. He began to look around and see everything desirable in life as nothing more than a trap, just waiting to be sprung.
So, all the things people strive for, the riches, the joys, shelter, food, heat, clothing, they are simply the bait. It became this cherished pastime for our hungry peddler to just watch the world around him. He'd sit there and think of people he knew who touched the bait and allowed the snare to snap shut on them. And let's be honest here, we probably all know a few folks circling the cheese right now, completely unaware of the trap.
Section 2. Taking the bait, testing the feud. But you know, a theory is really just a theory until it's actually tested, right? So on a dark, dreary evening, our peddler is seeking shelter and knocks on the door of a little gray cottage. Inside lives an old crofter, a lonely guy without a wife or kids. Now, instead of the sour faces the peddler usually gets, this old man offers incredible hospitality. We're talking hot porridge, tobacco, and good conversation. But he also provides something else: temptation. The old crofter proudly explains that his cow earns him a really good living. And just to prove it, he takes down a leather pouch from the window frame and shows the peddler exactly 30 kroner. 3 wrinkly 10-kroner bills. The bait has officially been set. The very next morning, both men leave the cottage. But the peddler's cynical philosophy is about to become his reality. He comes back just half an hour later. He doesn't even try the door. He simply walks right up to the window, smashes a pane of glass, reaches in and grabs that pouch. He pockets the 30 kroner and then very carefully hangs the empty pouch right back in its place. As he walks away with the cash, he initially feels pretty darn pleased with his own smartness. I mean, he took the cheese and he got away with it. Or so he thinks. Realizing he absolutely cannot risk walking down the public highway with stolen money, he takes a fateful step into the woods. At first, it's totally fine, but as the hours drag on, the paths twist back and forth strangely. He walks and walks, only to realize, with a sinking feeling, that he's been circling the exact same part of the forest. And then the pure terror hits him. He remembers his own theory. His turn has come. The bait fooled him, and now this entire forest, with its giant trunks and fallen logs, has closed in upon him like an impenetrable prison. The gloom and despair completely take over, and exhausted to the literal point of death, he just collapses onto the freezing, dark December ground. Section 3. The Iron Master's Mistake. A Fatal Encounter. Just as our peddler thinks his absolute last moment has arrived, he hears it, a hard, regular thumping. Hammer strokes. He staggers toward the sound and stumbles into the Ramsjö ironworks.
He slips into the noisy, dark forge just to sleep near the warm furnace. The blacksmiths there barely even glance at the dirty ragamuffin. But then, the owner of the mill, this very prominent ironmaster, comes in for his nightly inspection. In the dim, flickering glow of the furnace, the ironmaster looks closely at the vagabond and makes a monumental error. He mistakes the ragged tramp for an old regimental comrade, calling out, "But of course it is you, Nils Olaf, Captain von Stahl." The ironmaster, thrilled to see his, quote, friend, immediately insists that he come home with him to the manor house for Christmas. But the peddler is terrified. Why? Because he's thinking of those stolen 30 kroner sitting right there in his pocket. To accept this invitation and go to a wealthy manor house would be, in his mind, exactly like throwing himself voluntarily into the lion's den. All he wants is to sneak away inconspicuously. So he says no, and no, and no again, eventually forcing the disappointed ironmaster to retreat.
Section 4. Edla's empathy. Unconditional kindness.
Now the ironmaster isn't one to give up easily, so he sends his daughter, Edla, down to the forge, hoping she has slightly better powers of persuasion. And she does. Edla is modest, shy, but incredibly perceptive. She notices right away that the man is terrified, quickly deducing he has either stolen something or escaped from jail. Yet she speaks to him with such profound, gentle compassion, assuring him he can leave whenever he wants, that he finally actually trusts her. But the next morning on Christmas Eve, disaster strikes. The tramp is bathed, shaved, and dressed up in a fine suit. And standing there in broad daylight, the ironmaster immediately realizes his massive mistake. The man is definitely not the captain. The ironmaster is absolutely furious, threatening to call the sheriff right then and there. But Edla does something completely unexpected. She closes the door and intercedes for the vagabond. But actually, right before Edla steps in to save him, the peddler furiously defends himself. He takes a step forward, literally slams his fist down on the table, and just unleashes his entire cynical worldview on the wealthy ironmaster. He declares that the whole world is a rat trap. All these fine clothes and good food, they're just cheese rinds and bits of pork designed to drag a poor fellow into trouble. He even looks the ironmaster in the eye and warns him that one day he too might reach for a piece of pork and get caught. It's an intensely powerful moment where the vagabond completely weaponizes his own life philosophy.
So I want you to really think about this as we go through this explainer. Why on earth does Edla do this? She knows he's not a captain. She highly suspects he's a criminal. Yet she stands up to her father and says they cannot chase away a human being they explicitly promised Christmas cheer to. She leads him to the table, she feeds him, and she lets him sleep safely for probably the first time in years. She offers him this radical, unconditional empathy, completely bypassing all the rules of the rat trap world that the peddler so firmly believes in.
Section 5. Escaping the Trap, Christmas Redemption.
So now we move to Christmas morning. Edla and her father are at church, where they learn a terrible, embarrassing truth. An old crofter was recently robbed by a man going around selling rat traps. Rushing back home for what they assume will be the dramatic payoff of this whole ordeal, they are fully expecting to find their house burglarized. But instead, the valet informs them the stranger has left, and he took absolutely nothing. In fact, he left a poorly wrapped package specifically for Edla. Inside, she finds a small, handmade rat trap, those same 3 wrinkled 10-kroner bills, and a letter. And this letter? It's just a beautiful resolution to our metaphorical journey. He asks Edla to please return the 30 kroner to the old man on the roadside. But it's his closing words that really hit home. He writes that the present is from a rat who absolutely would have been caught in this world's trap if he had not been raised to a captain. Because Edla treated him with the dignity and respect of a real captain, he actually found the power within himself to clear his own name. And he signs it Captain von Stahl. You see, he didn't just escape the literal trap of his theft. He escaped the philosophical trap of his own deep cynicism. Selma Lagerlöf leaves us with this incredible testament to human connection. By flat-out refusing to offer bait and instead offering genuine love and understanding, Edla awakened the essential goodness in a desperate man. So as we wrap up this explainer, here's a specific thing to try. Look for these moments in your own life. Have you known of an episode where a simple act of kindness completely changed a person's entire view of the world? Keep an eye out for those opportunities, and maybe, just maybe, try to be the one who offers them.
Welcome back, everyone, to another explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a really fascinating, honestly pretty heated dynamic. Think about it. The interview was invented just a little over 130 years ago, and since then, it has become an absolute staple of our daily lives. I mean, almost everyone who reads has come across one. But here's the thing. The debate over its moral value and its actual function is literally as old as the medium itself. We're looking at a huge question here. Is an interview the supreme art form that extracts raw contemporary truth, or is it just an unwarranted, maybe even vicious intrusion into someone's private life? We are going to unpack this whole 130-year-old debate, and then we'll look at one of the absolute most brilliant examples of the medium in action.
Let's kick things off with this incredibly visceral quote from the Nobel Prize-winning author Saul Bellow. He said, "Interviews are like thumbprints on his windpipe." Wow, right? It just instantly helps us grasp how deeply, literally almost physically, some subjects absolutely despise being interviewed. Now, Bellow did actually consent to several interviews over his life, but he still felt they were totally suffocating. And as you'll see, he is definitely not the only celebrity or writer to feel this way.
So we're looking at a massive paradox here. On one side of the ring, you've got critics like Dennis Bryan. He argues that interviews are hands down our most vivid source of contemporary truth. Bryan makes the point that almost everything of moment reaches us through one person just asking questions of another, which honestly gives the interviewer this unprecedented level of power. But then, on the flip side, you have the subjects themselves. A lot of celebrities feel an interview completely diminishes them. Actually, some even equate the feeling to those primitive cultures that believe taking a photographic portrait of someone literally stole a piece of their soul. The writer V.S. Naipaul even went as far as to say that people are wounded by interviews, like they actually lose a part of themselves.
Part 1. Writers who hate interviews, the victims of the medium.
Historically, a lot of writers saw themselves as straight-up victims of this whole process. Take Lewis Carroll, the guy who created Alice in Wonderland. He had what was famously described as a just horror of the interviewer. He actively repelled would-be acquaintances, persistent autograph seekers, reporters, you name it. He never consented to be interviewed because he had this profound horror of being lionized, being treated like a celebrity animal on display. And he actually took a lot of satisfaction, a lot of amusement in just shutting those petitioners down.
Then we have Rudyard Kipling, who was even more aggressive about it. If you look at his wife Caroline's diary from October 1892, she mentions their day was completely wrecked by two reporters from Boston. Kipling felt aggressively assaulted. He literally called the interview a crime, an offense against his person, cowardly and vile, which honestly is incredibly ironic considering Kipling himself had perpetrated that exact same kind of assault on Mark Twain just a few years earlier.
Even the great H.G. Wells, the science fiction pioneer, referred to the whole thing as the interviewing ordeal back in 1894. But, much like Kipling, his relationship with the medium was kinda messy and full of contradictions. Because despite calling it an ordeal, Wells eventually became a pretty frequent interviewee himself, and, completely proving how serviceable the medium can be, he actually went on to interview Joseph Stalin 40 years later. No way, right?
Part 2. Meet Umberto Eco, the professor who writes on Sundays. So to really resolve this tension and see the raw power of a great interview, we're going to look at a fascinating conversation between journalist Mukund Padmanabhan and Umberto Eco. Now, before his massive mainstream success, we really need to understand who Eco was. He was a professor at the University of Bologna in Italy. Way before he ever wrote a drop of fiction, he had already built this formidable, world-class academic reputation. His expertise? Semiotics, which is the study of signs and symbols, along with literary interpretation and medieval aesthetics. This guy was an absolute intellectual powerhouse, first and foremost.
Part 3. The Secret of Interstices. Finding time in empty spaces.
During this interview, Mukund asks Eco the million-dollar question. How on earth does he manage to produce such a staggeringly massive amount of work across so many different genres? And Eco responds with this brilliant philosophy. He tells the interviewer to imagine eliminating all the empty spaces from the universe and all the empty space inside atoms. If you did that, the entire mass of the universe would literally shrink down to be the size of his fist. And he applies that exact same physical concept to human life. Our days, he argues, are mostly made up of empty spaces. He calls these empty spaces interstices.
Eco explains this perfectly with a really simple elevator analogy. He says to the interviewer, okay, say you're coming over to my place. You get in the elevator on the first floor. While you're riding up to my place on the third floor, I'm just waiting for you. That waiting period, that is an interstice, an empty space. So, immense productivity for Eco isn't about working crazy long hours. It's about working within these tiny empty spaces that the rest of us usually just waste. By the time that elevator arrives, Eco jokes he's already written an entire article.
Part 4. The Accidental Novelist, telling the story of research.
This incredibly unique approach to time totally bled into his unique writing style, too. Early on, Eco realized that academic writing didn't have to be this dry, boring list of facts. It could actually be a narrative story of the research itself, complete with all the trials and errors. And because his academic essays already had this deeply narrative aspect to them, making the jump to fiction wasn't actually a huge leap. In fact, he started writing novels completely by accident at the age of 50. Literally, he just had nothing to do one day, so he started writing. Fiction, for him, just satisfied his natural taste for narration. But this creates a really funny dynamic for him. Even though he achieved literal intellectual superstardom as a novelist, Eco absolutely insists his true identity is a scholar. Get this, he wrote just 5 novels, but over 40 scholarly works of nonfiction. It actually bugs him a little bit when people only know him as a novelist. He very proudly considers himself a university professor who just happens to write novels on Sundays. He's the guy going to academic conferences, not pen club meetings.
Now, what is truly staggering is this number, 10 to 15 million. That is the estimated number of copies sold of his massive 1980 breakout novel, The Name of the Rose. And while he fully admits that writing novels lets him reach a way larger audience than his academic work on semiotics ever could in a million years, the sheer scale of this success was just completely unprecedented.
And the publishing world? They were totally blindsided by this, because The Name of the Rose is absolutely not some simple beach read. It is a highly complex detective yarn that dives deep into metaphysics, theology, and medieval history. His American publisher actually loved the book, but just assumed no one in a country without medieval cathedrals or Latin studies would ever read it. They gave him a tiny advance for just 3,000 copies. Well, it ended up selling 2 or 3 million copies in the US alone. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that Eco proved the entire media establishment wrong. He points out that journalists and publishers are often super puzzled by his success, mainly because they operate on this flawed assumption that people only like trash and actively avoid difficult reading experiences. Eco argues that out of the 6 billion people on the planet, a very significant percentage actually craves something a lot deeper. And yeah, sure, even Eco himself likes to zone out and watch easy television. He mentioned liking Miami Vice at 9 p.m., but people don't want that all day. They want to be challenged.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want you to reflect on your own habits for a second. Do you crave difficult reading experiences? And honestly, more importantly, let's think back to the very beginning of our explainer today. Doesn't this deep, highly revealing conversation with Umberto Eco completely prove the critic Dennis Bryan right? I mean, despite all the complaints from writers like Carroll and Kipling, the interview is a medium that, when it's executed with real curiosity and respect, can extract some of the most incredible, unexpected wisdom from extraordinary minds. Keep exploring those interstices, focused learners, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.
Welcome to this explainer. Let's jump right in, shall we? Today, we are unpacking the timeless wisdom of the legendary poet John Keats. Specifically, we're going to explore a really fascinating aspect of his work, how art and nature act as these incredibly powerful, practical antidotes to human suffering. We're going to see exactly how Keats paints these insanely vivid pictures with his words, basically creating a visual style that guides us right out of the darkness.
Okay, before we get to the text, I want you to just reflect on your own life for a second. Think about it. When you face gloomy days or you hit a rough patch, what pleasure do beautiful things actually give you? And are they truly worth treasuring? Just keep that personal reflection in the back of your mind, because this is exactly the emotional landscape Keats was exploring. He wasn't just, stringing together pretty words. He was offering us something very real, to try a completely different narrative approach to how we frame our relationship with the world around us.
So to really ground our understanding, we have to look at the guy behind the words, John Keats. He lived from 1795 to 1821, making him a foundational British Romantic poet. But here is the wild part. He actually trained to be a surgeon. Yeah, a surgeon. But he eventually decided, nope, I'm devoting my entire life to poetry. Keats had this amazing, almost supernatural gift for perceiving the world and living his moods entirely through language. Now, the excerpt we're looking at today comes from a much longer epic called Endymion, a poetic romance. It's based on an old Greek legend where a young shepherd and poet named Endymion gets this vision of Cynthia, the moon goddess. He literally wanders through dense forests and completely under the sea just to find her. It is the ultimate grand quest for beauty.
Right, so Keats opens this excerpt with an absolute mic drop of a thesis. He writes, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases, it will never pass into nothingness." With just these 3 lines, he establishes this profound, massive idea. True beauty, it's not temporary. It doesn't just stick around. Its loveliness actively increases over time. It literally refuses to just fade away into nothingness. If we choose to see it, beauty is a permanent fixture in our life.
But let's be real. What does this permanent beauty actually do for us on a practical level? Well, Keats promises that this eternal beauty creates a quiet sanctuary for us. He calls it a bower, quiet for us. Think of a bower as this incredibly peaceful, shady little spot tucked under the trees. And inside this sanctuary, whether it's mental or physical, beauty grants us sleep full of sweet dreams, health, and just quiet breathing. I mean, think about that. It is quite literally a prescription for peace, written by a poet who used to be a surgeon. Now, what's super fascinating here is this incredibly vivid contrast Keats sets up. On one side, he fully acknowledges the harsh, brutal reality of human misery. He talks about despondence, this inhuman dearth of noble natures, our gloomy days, and all the unhealthy and or darkened ways we just have to trudge through. Life is hard, he gets it. But then, on the flip side, he offers the cure. He says that on every tomorrow, we are wreathing a flowery band to bind us to the earth. Essentially, he's saying that recognizing beauty isn't passive. It's an active practice. It's something you literally have to try to do. And doing so weaves this lifeline that keeps us grounded and connected to the world, despite all the suffering. He goes on to explain that, even when our spirits are pitch black, some shape of beauty is always there to move away the pall, that heavy, suffocating cloud of sadness. And to start, he tells us to just look up. He points to celestial bodies, writing, "Such the sun, the moon. These are our constant, universal shapes of beauty. They shine down on every single one of us, offering this grand sense of scale and awe that just lifts that darkness right out of our minds." Let's keep going and watch how he builds on this. Keats shifts our gaze from the massive sky right back down to the dirt. He zooms all the way in on grounded, natural bounties. He points out trees, old and young, sprouting a shady boon for simple sheep. I love this part because he's finding deep beauty in the innocent, the simple, and the protective nature of trees just giving shade. And then he moves to daffodils with the green world they live in. He's building this incredible visual narrative for us, basically asking us to mentally construct this vibrant, green, living ecosystem as our own personal defense against the gloom. Real quick, before we keep diving into his lush, deep woods imagery, let's just define a couple of the older terms he throws at us so we don't miss a single detail. First up is rills, which are basically just small streams of water. And then there's brake, which refers to a really thick, dense mass of ferns. Got it? Okay, let's press on. So, knowing those words brilliantly illustrates this next point. Keats writes about those clear rills that create a cooling covert or a refreshing shelter against the hot season. Once again, notice the narrative he's weaving here. It's all about relief. Beauty acts as cool, flowing water against the intense heat of our suffering. He also brings up the mid-forest brake, which he says is rich with a sprinkling of fair musk rose blooms. He's completely immersing all of our senses in this cooling, fragrant, gorgeous forest escape. But then, Keats makes this completely unexpected, totally fascinating pivot. He steps away from the physical beauty of the natural world and focuses entirely on human legacy. He writes, "And such too is the grandeur of the dooms we have imagined for the mighty dead." So what he's saying is that the glorious destinies, those powerful, lasting legacies of great people who came before us, those are in themselves just another shape of beauty that can lift our spirits. He actually elevates art and storytelling up to the exact same level as the sun, the moon, and nature. He boldly declares that all lovely tales that we have heard or read function as an endless fountain of immortal drink pouring onto us from the heaven's brink. Just pause and picture that imagery for a second. Stories, poetry, art, they are an immortal drink, pouring directly down from heaven just to nourish us. It is an absolutely stunning visual metaphor for the sheer power of human creativity. So if we pull all of this together, we can literally map out the specific cures Keats identifies right alongside the very real human sufferings they're meant to counteract. It's like a balance sheet. On one side, you have the sun, the moon, the daffodils, the clear rills, and lovely tales, and those stand in direct, powerful opposition to despondence, a lack of noble natures, and our gloomy days. For Keats, beauty is definitely not just decorative. It's highly functional. It's the ultimate counterweight to our pain. And honestly, it is not just what he says, it is how he says it. As you go off and explore this piece on your own, I really want you to pay close attention to the musicality of the text. Notice how the consistent rhyme scheme and those perfectly balanced sentence structures actually mirror the exact harmonious beauty he's describing. Just listen to the rhythm here of noble natures, of the gloomy days, of all the unhealthy and overdarkened ways. The very symmetry in the poem's structure acts as this incredibly stabilizing, beautiful force for us as we read it. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to take away from this explainer today, a question pulled straight from our source material's reflections. Based on everything Keats just laid out for us, the immortal drink of tales, the increasing loveliness of the world, those flowery bands we weave, do we experience things of beauty only for fleeting short moments, or do they actually make a lasting, permanent impression on our souls? The next time you face a gloomy day, I challenge you to try something. Go seek out your own sun, your moon, or a lovely tale, and just see if that beauty doesn't stick with you forever. Welcome, everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled you're here for today's explainer. Today we're diving into a profoundly personal, honestly riveting hero's journey. But our hero isn't out there fighting dragons or battling armies. No, he's actually fighting his own mortality and a paralyzing, suffocating monster living right inside his own mind, hydrophobia. We're going to be exploring an autobiographical account from William O. Douglas. Now, you might know him as the longest-serving justice in U.S. Supreme Court history. But long before that, he was literally just a skinny kid who had to figure out how to conquer absolute pure terror. Just listen to this incredibly dark, visceral reflection from Douglas. He writes, "I crossed to oblivion, and the curtain of life fell." Wow. He's not speaking metaphorically here. He's talking about a literal near-death experience from his childhood, a moment where he felt his life just completely extinguished. And this single traumatic event, it essentially set the emotional stakes for the rest of his early life. It cemented a fear so deep that it completely rewired how he interacted with the world around him. Okay, let's dive into this and look at exactly how this phobia began. Douglas was about 10 or 11 years old, and he decided, hey, I want to learn to swim. Geographically, he lived right near the Yakima River in Washington state. Now, his mother continuously warned him against the Yakima. She called it treacherous, and she made sure to keep the gruesome details of every single local drowning fresh in his young mind. So, quite logically, Douglas opted for what he thought was a highly controlled, incredibly safe environment, the local YMCA pool. It had a shallow end that was only 2 or 3 feet deep. He even bought a pair of water rings to help him float. He hated showing off his skinny legs, but he swallowed his pride and he waded in. But that supposedly safe pool quickly turned into an absolute nightmare. Douglas was sitting alone by the edge of the water one day. He was a bit too timid to go in by himself, so he was just waiting for others to arrive. And then, suddenly, this big, muscular 18-year-old bruiser of a boy walks in, looks right at him, and yells, "Hi, skinny, how'd you like to be ducked?" And without any warning whatsoever, this older boy picked young Douglas up and violently tossed him straight into the 9-foot deep end of the pool. Douglas landed in a sitting position, instantly swallowed a mouthful of water, and immediately began sinking straight to the bottom. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the human brain attempts to rationalize survival right in the midst of a sudden crisis. Because even as he was sinking, Douglas wasn't entirely out of his wits yet. He actively formulated what seemed like a totally logical 3-step survival strategy. Step 1, wait until his feet hit the tiled bottom. Step 2, summon every ounce of his strength and spring upward, hoping he'd just bob to the surface like a cork. And Step 3, lie flat, strike out with his arms, thrash with his legs, and paddle to the safety of the edge. Honestly, it sounds like a pretty solid plan, right? But the grim reality is that those 9 feet felt a whole lot more like 90. So when his feet finally hit the bottom, he jumped with absolutely everything he had. But his strategy completely failed. He didn't bob to the surface like a cork. No, he came up agonizingly slowly. And when he finally opened his eyes, he saw nothing but this suffocating, dirty yellow water. Panic just instantly seized him. He reached out, desperately hoping to grab a rope, but his hands just clutched at empty liquid. He tried to yell for help, but literally no sound came out. His lungs ached, his head was throbbing, and he was completely suffocating as he began to sink down, endlessly for a second time into that terrifying yellow glow. And as he sank, sheer, stark terror took complete control. This wasn't just everyday fear. It was like an electricity that totally hijacked his nervous system.
He tried to bring his legs up to kick, but they just hung there like dead weights, completely paralyzed, completely rigid. He was literally shrieking underwater, but his screams were utterly frozen in his throat. He tried his jumping strategy a second and then a third time, but nothing worked. He just kept swallowing water instead of air. And then finally, all effort just ceased. A blackness swept over his brain, completely wiping out the terror. He relaxed, feeling drowsy, just floating into space, right up until he crossed to oblivion.
Thankfully, someone pulled him out. He woke up vomiting right by the side of the pool. But that physical rescue didn't save him from the psychological prison he was now in. This one childhood trauma had these massive, cascading, paralyzing effects on his adult life. Whenever he tried to embrace nature, whether he was wading in the Cascades, fishing for landlocked salmon in Maine, bass fishing up in New Hampshire, or trout fishing out in Oregon, that exact same icy horror would just grab his heart. His legs would become paralyzed all over again. This single event completely deprived him of the joy of canoeing, boating, and swimming literally anywhere in the United States. It was a severe handicap that totally ruined his outdoor life.
But here's where the story turns. Douglas absolutely refused to be a prisoner to this forever. He wanted his life back. So years later, he made a conscious, intensely determined decision. Instead of just sitting around hoping the fear would magically vanish, he transitioned from being a victim of his fear to becoming a student of it. He developed a highly specific list of things to try, starting with hiring a professional swimming instructor to systematically deconstruct his phobia. He fully committed to this, practicing 5 days a week, an hour each day. He was going to dismantle that monster of fear piece by piece and build a swimmer from the ground up.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how you conquer an impossible mountain. You take it one meticulous step at a time. The instructor didn't just throw him back in the water. That would have been a disaster. First, he put a belt around Douglas and attached it to a rope that ran on an overhead pulley cable. The instructor held the rope, and they just went back and forth across the pool like that for weeks. Then, he taught Douglas to put his face underwater to exhale and raise his nose to inhale. He repeated this hundreds of times just to shed that initial panic of having water cover his head. And finally, he had Douglas hold the edge of the pool and just practice kicking. At first, his legs totally refused to work, remember those paralyzed, dead weights? But gradually, week by week, they relaxed until he could fully command them. Piece by piece, that instructor built a swimmer.
By April, the instructor told him he was finally ready. But Douglas knew the true test wasn't just performing for a teacher. It was facing his own mind when he was completely alone in the pool. When he started swimming lengths by himself, tiny little vestiges of that old terror would occasionally creep back into his brain. But this time, instead of freezing up, Douglas pushed back. He actually started talking to his fear. He'd literally frown at the water and say, "Trying to scare me, huh? Well, here's to you. Look." And then he'd aggressively swim another length of the pool. He was actively mocking the very thing that used to paralyze him. How incredible is that?
But conquering the controlled environment of a tiled pool, that wasn't the finish line. Douglas had to know if the fear had truly fled in the wild, unpredictable waters that originally haunted him. So he traveled to Lake Wentworth in New Hampshire, dived right off a dock, and swam 2 full miles across the lake to Stamp Act Island. He did the crawl, the breaststroke, the side stroke, and the backstroke. At one point, in the very middle of the lake, he put his face under and saw nothing but bottomless water. A tiny, miniature version of the Terror tried to return, but he just laughed, asked Mr. Terror what he thought he could do, and kept right on swimming. He later cemented this massive victory by plunging into Warm Lake in the high meadows of the Cascades. The fear was finally permanently gone.
Which brings us to the profound thematic climax of our explainer, and it's perfectly captured by a quote from a man Douglas would actually later advise and befriend, President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He famously said, "All we have to fear is fear itself." Through this grueling journey, Douglas realized a deeply philosophical truth. In death, there's actually only peace. The real terror is only found in the fear of death. Because Douglas had experienced both the literal sensation of dying at the bottom of that YMCA pool and the sheer exhausting terror that the fear of it produced throughout his life, his ultimate will to live grew with incredible intensity. By fully facing his ultimate fear, he earned absolute freedom. So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a direct challenge inspired by these very exercises. Think about the geography around you for a second. Are there any lakes, rivers, or situations you've been actively avoiding? But more importantly, think about what happens to the human brain when we actually lean into the things that terrify us the most.
Could the exact thing that paralyzes you actually be the key to unlocking your own absolute freedom? It's something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for today's explainer. Until next time, find your fear, face it piece by piece, and free yourself to walk your own trails.
Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a true classic, Selma Lagerlöf's short story, The Rat Trap. Now, at its core, this narrative reads almost like a fairy tale about human nature, but it asks a genuinely profound question that still totally resonates with us today. Can the essential goodness within a human being actually be awakened through simple understanding and unconditional love? We're going to map out the psychology of a desperate man and see how just one unexpected encounter changes his entire reality. Let's get into it.
Okay, so we have to start with this incredibly dark but fascinating premise. What if the entire world is just a trap designed to catch you? It's a pretty cynical lens to view life through, right? But as you'll see, for our main character, it's literally a survival mechanism.
To really wrap our heads around this, we need to meet our protagonist. He's an unnamed, severely impoverished vagabond. His clothes are in absolute rags, his cheeks are sunken, and starvation just sort of gleams in his eyes. He makes this really meager living wandering the roads, selling small wire rat traps that he crafts from random materials he begs for. And it's during one of these dreary, monotonous walks that he stumbles upon a thought that brings him this strange, dark joy. He decides the whole world around him is, well, nothing but a giant rat trap.
And this perfectly captures the visual style and central metaphor we'll be exploring today. The humble wire trap he sells isn't just a physical object to help him scrape by. It becomes this overarching symbol for the entire human predicament. He deeply believes the world has never existed for any other purpose than to just set baits for people.
Moving into Part 1, The Giant Rat Trap, Deconstructing a Cynical Philosophy.
So let's break down how this guy actually views the mechanics of life. To the peddler, this cycle is purely mechanical and completely inevitable. First, the world sets out bait. You know, things we all want like riches, joys, shelter, food. Second, a person lets themselves be tempted to just touch that bait. And third, snap. The trap closes in and everything comes to an end. Because the world has been so terribly unkind to him, he actually finds it super entertaining to trudge along the road imagining other people getting caught in this massive snare.
But then, his monotonous life takes a really sharp turn one dark evening. He knocks on the door of a gray cottage by the roadside, just expecting the usual door slammed in his face. But instead of being chased away, an old, lonely crofter actually invites him in. The old man is thrilled just to have someone to talk to. They share porridge, a big slice of tobacco, and even stay up playing a card game called Njoli's. It's this incredibly rare, warm moment of human connection for our vagabond.
Which brings us to Part 2, Taking the Bait, the temptation at the window frame.
So the old man is so proud of his cow that he starts bragging about earning 30 kronor for its milk in just the last month. And when the peddler seems a little skeptical, the crofter actually goes to the window, takes down a leather pouch hanging right there on the frame, and pulls out 3 wrinkled 10 kronor bills, 30 kronor in total. He essentially dangles it right in front of a starving, desperate man. For a guy who literally sees the world as a trap, I mean, he's just been presented with the ultimate piece of cheese.
And you can probably guess what happens next. Despite the incredible kindness shown to him the night before, the peddler simply cannot resist the cheese. Just half an hour after they both leave the cottage, he sneaks back. He smashes the window pane, sticks his hand right in, and steals those 30 kronor, stuffing him into his pocket before taking off.
Now we hit Part 3. The trap closes. Lost in the confusing forest.
Terrified he'll be caught if he stays on the main highway with stolen cash, the peddler ditches the road and heads deep into the woods. And this is where his abstract psychological trap suddenly becomes a terrifying physical reality. He wanders for hours in this confusing forest, only to realize with utter despair that he's just been walking in circles. The bitter irony hits him like a ton of bricks. All this time he was laughing at others, but now his own turn has finally come. The whole forest had closed in upon him like an impenetrable prison. He realizes he is now the rat.
Part 4. Unexpected Warmth, The Ramshow Iron Works, and a Collision of Worldviews.
Just as a freezing December darkness sets in and he completely accepts his doom, he hears the thumping of hammer strokes. He staggers toward the sound and finds himself at the Ramjo Ironworks. He sneaks into the forge, and here we get a fascinating clash of two very different worldviews. First, the wealthy ironmaster spots him. He looks closely at the filthy vagabond in the dim light and makes a massive mistake. He thinks the peddler is an old regimental comrade of his. He offers to take him home, but notice, this is conditional hospitality. It's based entirely on this false high status. The peddler refuses, obviously terrified of being found out, but then, enter the ironmaster's daughter, Edla. She has a radically different approach. She instantly notices the man is terrified, realizing he's either stolen something or escaped from jail. Yet she offers true, unmerited grace anyway, promising him a safe, peaceful Christmas Eve where he can leave whenever he wants. Winning his trust, she takes him home.
So, the peddler gets bathed, shaved, and dressed in a fine suit. But the next morning brings a harsh reality check. In the unforgiving daylight of the dining room, the ironmaster immediately realizes his mistake. The vagabond is clearly not his old buddy. Furious at the deception, the ironmaster threatens to call the sheriff. The peddler defensively argues that, hey, the world is a rat trap and one day the ironmaster might get caught too. The ironmaster just laughs and orders him out. But then Edla steps in. She physically walks over and closes the door, stopping the peddler from leaving.
So I want you to ask yourself, why? Why insist on sharing Christmas cheer with a known vagabond who let your father be deceived? Her father calls it a huge mistake, but Edla argues that they absolutely shouldn't chase away a human being they explicitly invited and promised peace to. For Edla, it's entirely about honoring human dignity. It's completely detached from the man's societal worth or his past sins. She just wants him to have one single day of peace in a life of constant running.
And that leads us to part 5, the final escape, the transformative power of kindness. Edla's radical kindness does something that the threat of the sheriff or even that freezing forest never could. It actually provides the key to open his trap. She treats him like a real captain all throughout Christmas Eve. Fast forward to the next morning, she and her father go to church, where they learn some horrifying news. A vagabond selling rat traps just robbed their old crofter. They rush home, completely expecting all their family's silver to be gone. But nope, they find the peddler has left, and he left behind a highly symbolic package for Edla, a small wire rat trap, the stolen 30 kronar, and a heartfelt letter. Within that letter is this incredible, profound confession. He writes, "The rat trap is a Christmas present from a rat who would have been caught in this world's rat trap if he had not been raised to captain, because in that way he got power to clear himself." And get this, he signs it Captain von Stahl. Visually and narratively, this cements the whole explainer. Edla's grace gave him the strength to elevate himself above his desperate circumstances. Her belief in him literally transformed him, allowing him to finally truly break free from his own cynical trap.
To wrap up our explainer today, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. Can a single act of unconditional love and understanding permanently alter how a person views the world? The peddler's journey from a cynical, starving rat into an honorable man suggests that while the world may absolutely be full of tempting bait, true compassion is the ultimate key to the cage. As a specific thing to try this week, think about how you might try offering that kind of unmerited grace to someone in your own life. Just see what happens. Thank you so much for exploring this narrative with me, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.
Let's jump right into this explainer of Susan Hill's remarkable play, On the Face of It. We're going to unpack a profoundly moving character study today, one that tackles the heavy themes of trauma, societal prejudice, and that desperate human need for connection. Honestly, if you've ever felt misunderstood, or if you've ever just wanted to hide away from the judgment of the outside world, this journey is going to resonate so deeply with you.
So what happens when two people hiding from the world accidentally collide? That question right there, that frames our entire journey today. It drops us smack in the middle of this intense psychological drama. On one side, you've got a deeply withdrawn, defensive young boy, and on the other, an eccentric, defiant older man. And their collision isn't just physical, it's this massive clash of worldviews that forces both of them to confront exactly how they've chosen to survive their own pain.
Which brings us to our first section, an unexpected meeting, the collision of two worlds.
Picture this, an overgrown, completely silent garden. A 14-year-old boy named Derry is creeping into what he genuinely believes is a deserted space.
But then, as he's navigating the long grass under these old crabapple trees, he's suddenly caught by the garden's owner, an older man named Mr. Lamb. The tension of this initial encounter is palpable. It captures that terrifying, heart-dropping moment of being exposed when you thought you were completely invisible.
Derry's panic in this moment is just instantly obvious. He literally stammers out, "I thought it was empty. I didn't know there was anybody here." And this perfectly illustrates his profound desire to remain unseen. You think Derry isn't just looking for a quiet spot in nature, he is actively fleeing from society. Stumbling across another human being in this garden is basically his absolute worst-case scenario.
Moving into Section 2, two kinds of scars, physical wounds and psychological states.
Here we really get to the heart of how two very different people process immense physical trauma. Look at the contrast. On one hand, we have Derry. He suffered horrific acid burn to one side of his face, and he's processed that trauma through corrosive bitterness, self-hatred, and just this overwhelming fear of others. But on the other hand, we have Mr. Lamb. He lost his leg to a bomb in the war and now has a tin leg. Yet, his psychological state is one of acceptance, openness, and total calm. It's wild, right? It's the exact same catalyst, massive physical trauma, but it's resulted in two entirely different psychological survival strategies.
The tragic depth of Derry's defense mechanism is honestly devastating. He says, "It ate my face up. It ate me up." That confession right there shows how his physical scar has completely consumed his internal identity. The acid didn't just burn his skin. In Derry's mind, it destroyed his entire sense of self-worth. He genuinely believes there's absolutely nothing left of the boy he was before the accident, just the monster that he thinks society sees now.
Let's explore how that shifts in Section 3. A matter of perspective, weeds, flowers, and singing bees.
To challenge Derry, Mr. Lamb points to a patch of overgrown plants in his garden and asks the boy what he sees. Derry naturally says it's just rubbish and weeds. But Mr. Lamb counters that a weed is just another green growing plant. It's a form of life, biologically no different from a beautiful flower. The distinction between a prize flower and an unwanted weed, that's entirely a human invention. He's subtly teaching Derry a huge lesson here. Society's label of ugly or broken is just that, an arbitrary label. It's not a fundamental truth about a person's worth. It's all life, growing, same as you and me.
And Mr. Lamb pushes this perspective shift even further. He tells Derry about a hive of bees he keeps behind the trees. He notes that, while some people hear bees and immediately complain about that annoying buzzing, a patient listener, they hear them humming, even singing. It's the exact same sound in nature, but a totally different experience based entirely on the listener's mindset. He's basically begging Derry to stop listening to the harsh buzzing of a cruel society and start tuning into the humming of the life all around him.
But change isn't easy, which brings us to Section 4, the prison of fear, internalizing societal prejudice.
To justify his isolation, Derry recounts this deeply painful memory to Mr. Lamb. He overheard a woman at a bus stop whispering this incredibly cruel remark. "That's a terrible thing. That's a face only a mother could love." Now, what's absolutely crucial to understand here is that this single, callous comment acts as the core proof for Derry's entire worldview. He has internalized this prejudice so deeply that he assumes everybody feels this way. He thinks people are fundamentally terrified of him, so he's convinced he has to hide away just to spare himself the pain of their inevitable rejection.
In response to this deeply ingrained fear, Mr. Lamb offers up a somewhat humorous but deeply tragic parable. He tells Derry about this wildly paranoid man who is terrified of absolutely everything: buses running him over, deadly germs, even slipping on a banana skin. To stay perfectly safe, this guy locks himself away in his room forever. He achieves total safe isolation. But then, in a twist of deeply ironic fate, a picture simply falls off the wall onto his head and kills him anyway. No escape, right? Mr. Lamb really brings the lesson home here. He warns Derry that harboring hatred and fear inside will do much, much more permanent damage to his soul than a bottle of acid ever did to his face. The acid, that was a one-time physical event, but closing himself off to the world, locking himself in a psychological room of bitterness, that is going to slowly burn him away from the inside out every single day for the rest of his life.
This leads right to our final section, the final choice, seeking the world.
When Derry finally goes home, we meet his mother, and she acts as the ultimate voice of societal fear and limitation. She's heard rumors about the eccentric Mr. Lamb and strictly forbids Derry from returning to the garden. She insists he stay locked away at home where it's safe, effectively trying to put him right back into that locked room from Mr. Lamb's parable.
She is suffocating him with the very protection he used to crave.
But look at how beautifully Derry has evolved here. Defying his mother's oppressive fear, Derry reaches this desperate, incredibly powerful realization. He says, if I don't go back there, I'll never go anywhere in this world again, and I want the world. This brilliantly illustrates his ultimate transformation. He refuses to be locked in a room of his own making anymore. He finally recognizes that, yes, living comes with risks, with buzzing bees and staring people, but experiencing the world, it is absolutely worth the vulnerability.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. When faced with the inevitable scars of life, whether they're physical, emotional, or psychological, whose worldview are you going to adopt? Are you going to let the acid of bitterness burn you away from the inside out, building walls out of fear? Or will you choose to listen to the humming of the bees and leave your gate open to the world? Thank you so much for exploring this profound story with me today. And remember, keep that gate open.
All right, let's jump straight into today's explainer. We are unpacking a classic piece of text that captures a profound socioeconomic clash. And honestly, it's a clash that is just as relevant today as the day it was written. We're looking at Robert Frost's incredible poem, A Roadside Stand. We're going to break down the text, analyze the really powerful imagery he uses, and see exactly what it tells us about the massive divide between urban wealth and rural struggle. But before we even look at a single line of poetry, I want you to ask yourself a foundational question drawn straight from the text. Think about the last time you were on a highway road trip. What do you actually observe at those small, dusty stalls by the side of the road? Do you just speed right past them? Do you ever really notice the people working there? Well, this simple, everyday scenario is the exact launch pad for the deep dive we're about to take. Part 1. An Introduction to Robert Frost. So we're looking at all of this through the lens of Robert Frost, a hugely acclaimed American poet from the 20th century. Now, you might know him for Snowy Woods or Changing Seasons, but he was actually so much more than a nature poet. Frost was a true chronicler of human tragedies, fears, and the absolute complexities of life. He focused incredibly closely on the lives of poor, deprived people. And the thing is, he didn't romanticize their poverty. He presented it with this pitiless clarity, yet with the deepest sympathy. And it's exactly that tension between cold reality and deep empathy that drives A Roadside Stand. Part 2. The Roadside Plea. The poem starts by setting a very specific scene, a little old house with a brand new shed right on the edge of a road where traffic is just zooming by. This setup creates a completely heartbreaking visual divide. On one hand, you have the city, represented by polished traffic racing past, minds focused entirely on the road ahead, symbolizing the relentless flow of money. And on the other hand, you have the country, defined by this little old house, its artless paint, and a very vulnerable, trusting sorrow. It is literally the rushed, wealthy city drivers versus the stationary, sorrowful rural farmers. So what are these rural folks actually asking for? Frost writes, "It would not be fair to say for a dole of bread, but for some of the money, the cash." Basically, the people running this stand aren't begging for scraps. They don't want a simple handout of food. They are desperately, pathetically pleading for a fair share of the city's cash flow. They want the exact same currency that keeps the flower of cities from sinking, hoping it might just help them build a life that goes beyond pure survival. Moving on to Part 3, the apathetic city traffic. Picture this. The rural stand is out there offering wild berries in wooden quarts, maybe some crook-necked golden squash. But how do the passing city drivers react? Well, the text is pretty stark. It says the polished traffic passed with a mind ahead. The speeding modern world simply ignores the people left behind. The drivers are entirely focused on their destinations, keeping their money, as Frost brilliantly puts it, crossly to themselves, completely indifferent to the plea of the countryside. Actually, scratch that. It gets worse. Because if the drivers do happen to look aside for a split second, it is only to complain. And their grievances are entirely superficial. They get annoyed that the beautiful mountain landscape is marred by the artless paint of the roadside stand. They complain about backward letters, like signs with the N turned wrong or the S turned wrong. It perfectly illustrates the absolute arrogance of the city folk. They literally only notice the rural poor when they find their poverty aesthetically unpleasing. Part 4. The Greedy Good Doers. Now the text shifts gears dramatically from the physical divide on the highway to the systemic divide. And look at the language here, it's incredible. Frost uses these striking oxymorons, greedy good doers and beneficent beasts of prey, to expose the total hypocrisy of politicians and social service agencies who supposedly step in to help. I mean, how can someone be a good doer and greedy?
How can a beast of prey be beneficent? It shows us that under the guise of charity, there's actually an underlying predatory exploitation happening. The news claims that these rural people will be bought out and mercifully gathered in to live in villages right next to the theater and the store. But the dark truth? It's just so they won't have to think for themselves anymore. These beneficent beasts basically swarm over the rural people's lives, enforcing benefits that are perfectly calculated to soothe them out of their wits. By domesticating them, they destroy their ancient, independent ways of sleeping at night and working the land. It is a chilling critique of what we call progress. Which brings us to Part 5, the poet's unbearable pain. Watching all of this, the coldness of the passing cars, the predatory nature of these supposed helpers, it becomes almost unbearable for the poet. He witnesses what he calls a childish longing in vain. He sees this palpable sadness lurking near the open window of the stand, where they wait all day in almost open prayer, just to hear the squeal of brakes. Out of the thousands of selfish cars passing by, they're just praying for one to stop and ask about a farmer's prices. And this is where Frost really twists the knife. Because, cars do occasionally stop. But why do they stop? One stops just to plow up the grass to back up and turn around. Another stops to ask for directions. And a third stops to ask if they can buy a gallon of gas, which, crossly, the stand obviously doesn't even sell. This perfectly captures the sheer disappointment of the situation. When a car finally stops, it is for purely selfish reasons. They are entirely blind to the country stand's actual offerings and its very existence. The sheer weight of this endless, ignored suffering leads the poet to a fleeting, macabre wish. He admits to a really dark fantasy, the great relief it would be to put these people at one stroke out of their pain. Wow, it is a shocking, chilling symbol. The poet is so overwhelmed by their hopeless situation that he briefly thinks erasing them entirely would be kinder than the slow, agonizing death of their independence and dignity. Now, he quickly snaps back to sanity, realizing how horrific it would be if someone offered to gently put him out of his pain. But just having the thought speaks volumes about the depth of this tragedy. Finally, Part 6, a balanced economic future. As the poet snaps back to reality, the text prompts us to bring this century-old message right into the present day. I want you to try this out yourself. Next time you're on the outskirts of your town or city, take a moment to really observe the roadside eateries and dabas. Look at the dynamics. How many travelers actually stop to eat? How many just use the driveway to turn around? And more importantly, how are those shopkeepers treated by the polished traffic of today? Look closely at their business and try to understand the life they lead. This poem isn't just history, folks, it is a mirror. And that leaves us with a massive question to end this explainer on. Does the economic well-being of a country depend on a balanced development of both the villages and the cities? Frost showed us the heavy human cost of a one-sided, urban-focused economy. So I'll leave you to ponder this macroeconomic thought. Can we truly thrive as a society if our modern polished progress continues to speed past and actively ignore the rural foundations it was built upon? Keep that in mind the next time you hit the open road.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly incredible piece of writing, Tishani Doshi's visceral, first-hand account of her expedition to Antarctica. It's a place where the sheer scale of Earth's history isn't just some abstract concept you read about in a textbook, it's literally written right there in the ice. If we really want to understand our planet's past, present, and where we might be heading in the future, there is honestly no better teacher than the stark, frozen wilderness down at the bottom of the world.
Just listen to how Doshi describes her arrival in Antarctica. She says, "It's like walking into a giant ping-pong ball devoid of any human markers." I mean, just imagine that for a second. You completely lose all earthly sense of perspective and time. There are no trees, no billboards, no buildings. You are completely stripped of the everyday context that usually anchors our daily reality. So, let's start with her journey to the ice, leaving the equator.
The whole thing kicks off aboard a Russian research vessel called the Academic Shikalsky, bravely navigating and wedging itself into the thick Antarctic ice. Our narrator actually started 13.09 degrees north of the equator in Madras, India, heading directly toward the absolute coldest, driest, and windiest continent on Earth. And to get there, it took 100 hours. That's a staggering 100 hours of continuous travel by car, airplane, and ship required just to set foot on this expansive white landscape.
You can only imagine the sheer wave of relief, quickly followed by profound wonder when she finally saw that uninterrupted blue horizon.
Reaching the edge of the world is a massive physical undertaking. We're talking crossing 9 separate time zones, passing through 6 checkpoints, and navigating 3 massive bodies of water, not to mention traversing multiple ecospheres along the way. It's a transition that literally and figuratively strips away everything you know.
Now, to really understand this place, we have to talk about deep time, specifically the supercontinent Gondwana.
It is absolutely mind-boggling to think about. Go back 650 million years, and there was this giant, amalgamated southern supercontinent called Gondwana, centered right around present-day Antarctica. And here's the kicker. It was actually warm. It hosted a huge variety of flora and fauna, and it thrived for 500 million years until the dinosaurs were wiped out. As the age of mammals began, that massive landmass was forced to separate into the countries and continents that shape our globe today.
Eventually, these massive geographical shifts created the global freezer we know today. Picture this: India pushing northwards, jamming against Asia to buckle the crust and actually form the Himalayas. Meanwhile, South America drifted off to join North America. This opened up the Drake Passage, which created a freezing cold circumpolar current. That very specific chain of events is what effectively locked Antarctica in a deep freeze, keeping it desolate and isolated at the bottom of the world, where it incredibly now stores 90% of the Earth's total ice volumes. Which brings us to what you could call the human blip, our 12,000 years of human history.
When you compare these timelines side by side, it really puts our human ego in check, doesn't it? The geological clock operates in millions and billions of years. In contrast, human civilization has been around for a paltry 12,000 years. In the grand scheme of Earth's history, our entire existence is barely a few seconds on the geological clock.
But man, in that shockingly short amount of time, we've managed to cause quite a ruckus. We've etched on dominance over nature with megacities, battled with other species for limited resources, and through the unmitigated burning of fossil fuels, we've essentially wrapped a blanket of carbon dioxide around the globe, and that is slowly but surely jacking up the average global temperature.
And that brings us to one of the most hotly contested environmental debates of our time. Are we looking at the end of the world as we know it? Will the West Antarctic ice sheet melt entirely? Will the Gulf Stream ocean current be disrupted? As the source text points out, maybe not. But either way, Antarctica is the absolute most crucial element in understanding this debate. Why? Because it's uniquely positioned. It's the only place in the world that has never sustained a human population, meaning it remains relatively pristine. But more importantly, it acts as this irreplaceable time capsule. Trapped deep within its layers of ice are cores holding half-million-year-old carbon records. If we want to impartially study the Earth's past, present, and future, this is exactly where we have to go.
But there's a proactive antidote to this existential dread, a program called Students on Ice. This initiative is headed by a Canadian named Jeff Green, and it takes high school students directly to the ends of the Earth. See, Green got tired of carting around retired, wealthy curiosity seekers who could only give back in a really limited way. Instead, he brings teenagers, the future generation of policymakers, at an exact age when they are ready to absorb, learn, and most importantly, act upon seeing retreating glaciers and collapsing ice shelves firsthand. It's an educational opportunity that fundamentally changes how you see the planet.
Now, let's zoom way in for a microscopic metaphor, what we'll call the phytoplankton parable.
Phytoplankton. If you aren't familiar, these are microscopic, single-celled plants that are basically the grasses of the sea. They use the sun's energy to assimilate carbon and synthesize organic compounds through photosynthesis. They're the absolute foundation that nourishes and sustains the entire Southern Ocean's food chain. And Antarctica's extremely simple ecosystem makes it the perfect place to study how tiny environmental changes impact these vital little organisms.
And this sets up a pretty terrifying chain reaction. First, scientists warn that if depletion in the ozone layer increases, it directly disrupts the photosynthesis activities of the phytoplankton. Then, that seemingly tiny disruption severely impacts the lives of all marine animals and birds in the region, which ultimately throws off the entire global carbon cycle.
There's this beautiful piece of wisdom from the text that perfectly captures this. Take care of the small things, and the big things will fall into place. It brilliantly illustrates the parable of the phytoplankton. It's such a profound metaphor for existence, isn't it? In a place as vast and mighty as Antarctica, with icebergs literally the size of Belgium, it's the microscopic life that holds the key to the survival of the whole shebang.
all of this built up to a major epiphany for the crew, literally walking on the ocean. Just short of the Antarctic Circle at 65.55 degrees south, their ship wedged itself into some thick ice between a peninsula and an island. Before turning back north, all 52 people aboard were instructed to climb down the gangplank. They literally walked out onto the stark whiteness of the ocean, as crab-eater seals stretched and sunned themselves in the periphery, kind of like stray dogs taking a nap under a banyan tree back home.
Seriously, just place yourself there for a second. You're standing there in your winter gear and sunglasses surrounded by a stark whiteness that seems to spread out forever. But it's just a 1-meter thick ice pack, and right beneath your boots, 180 meters of living, breathing salt water. The narrator describes it as nothing short of a revelation, a visceral moment where you suddenly realize that everything on this planet truly does connect.
After witnessing the immense beauty, the delicate balance, and the extreme fragility of our planet down at the end of the Earth, we are left with a pretty urgent reality. We know the climate has shifted wildly in the past, and yeah, a lot can happen in a million years, but seeing those teenagers, our future policymakers, reminds us of the sheer power of the present. The question isn't just about what happened deep in our past, but this: if the microscopic actions of phytoplankton can sustain an entire ocean, what monumental difference could our daily actions make today? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep wondering, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.
All right, let's jump right into today's explainer, because we're investigating a narrative that literally sits right on the edge of reality and imagination. We're looking at Jack Finney's classic story, The Third Level. Now, at first glance, you might think it's just your standard time travel fiction, but as we unpack the clues today, you'll see it's actually this profound psychological mystery. We're going to examine the evidence, track our protagonist's bizarre journey, and try to figure out what in the world is really going on in the depths of New York's most famous train station.
So, let's dive into this with a question straight from the text. Have you ever had a curious experience that others just found hard to believe? It's a fantastic hook, right? Because it immediately validates that what we're about to hear sounds absolutely crazy. Our narrator actually starts by challenging the official facts. He tells us that the presidents of the major New York railroads will swear on a stack of timetables that there are only 2 levels at Grand Central Station. I mean, imagine arguing with the railroad presidents themselves. But he insists, against all logic, that there are 3. And he knows this because he claims he's actually been on the 3rd level.
To really understand why this matters, we first got to understand the guy making the claim. Meet our protagonist, Charlie. He's just an ordinary guy, 31 years old, wearing a tan gabardine suit and a straw hat. He even admits he looks just like a dozen other men you'd pass on the street. But beneath that totally ordinary exterior, this is a man who is feeling the crushing weight of the mid-20th century. And honestly, that's a feeling a lot of us can relate to, right? He feels totally lost in a modern world full of insecurity, fear, war, and worry. He's working late at the office, he's just rushing to get a subway home to his wife Louisa, and he's deeply, fundamentally burnt out by the frantic pace of the crowd around him. So, when Charlie finally confides in his psychiatrist friend Sam about finding this impossible 3rd level, the doctor doesn't even hesitate. He diagnoses it right then and there as a waking dream wish fulfillment. Basically, Sam's saying Charlie is just unhappy. The modern world is just too much for him, and his mind has kind of manufactured this temporary refuge from reality. Even Charlie's friends agree. They point to his hobby of stamp collecting as just another way he's trying to escape the present day. It's a really neat, rational explanation for an entirely irrational event. You know, we all want to escape burnout, and Sam's argument is that Charlie's brain just took that desire to the extreme.
But the story builds on Charlie's disorienting daily commute. He describes Grand Central Station not as a static building, but as something organic, something alive. He says it's growing like a tree, constantly pushing out new corridors and staircases like roots under the city. He talks about bumping into new doorways, getting lost in mile-long tunnels, and literally popping up blocks away in hotel lobbies and office buildings. So for Charlie, the station is already this labyrinth. It's a place where reality feels, well, a little bit loose, making it the absolute perfect psychological setting for his mind to supposedly invent a hidden exit.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast between what Charlie is used to and what he suddenly discovers. He gets lost walking down from the 2nd level, where the modern suburban trains leave, and the tunnel slants downward. When he emerges, the entire environment has transformed. The modern hustle, completely gone. The room is smaller. The information booth isn't modern metal or stone, it's this old-looking wood. But the biggest giveaway is the lighting. The harsh modern electric bulbs are gone, replaced by dim, flickering open-flame gas lights. The noise and rush of his world have just vanished.
And Charlie is a sharp observer. The sensory details he notes are overwhelmingly specific. He isn't just feeling peaceful, he's looking at hard visual evidence of another era. The people around him are dressed in impossibly outdated fashions. Just imagine stepping off a modern subway and suddenly seeing men wearing derby hats, tiny lapelled four-button suits, and grand handlebar mustaches. He sees a woman step through a train gate wearing a dress with massive leg-of-mutton sleeves and high-button shoes. And out on the tracks, he spots a tiny Courier and Ives locomotive with a funnel-shaped stack. Everything screams that he's no longer in the present day. He is firmly in the 1890s.
But subjective observations aren't enough, right? Charlie needs proof. He glances down at a stack of newspapers at a newsboy's feet and recognizes the World. Now, this is a crucial piece of the puzzle because, as Charlie notes, the World hasn't been published for years. He catches the lead story about President Cleveland. And later on, just to verify his own sanity, Charlie actually goes to the public library files in the real world and finds this exact front page, confirming it was printed on June 11, 1894. So the date is completely locked in.
So, think about it. If you suddenly found yourself in 1894, what would you do? For Charlie, the answer is instant. He turns to the ticket window because he wants to buy 2 tickets to his ultimate fantasy of peace, Galesburg, Illinois. He remembers it as this wonderful town with big old frame houses, tremendous trees that roofed the streets, and summer evenings that felt twice as long. People just sat on huge lawns, smoking cigars and talking quietly. Most importantly, it's a peaceful world where the First World War is still 20 years away and World War II is over 40 years in the future. Who hasn't wanted to just step off the treadmill of modern anxiety? It is the absolute antithesis of his stressful life.
He has the destination, but there's a massive roadblock in his escape plan. Charlie has enough money for the fare, but when he hands it over, the clerk just stares at him. The clerk warns him, "That ain't money, mister," and shoots this threatening glance at the cash drawer. Charlie suddenly realizes his modern bills look completely different from the old style, much larger currency of 1894. Realizing the clerk thinks he's trying to pass fake money, Charlie turns and runs. Because, as he wisely points out, there's nothing nice about jail, even in 1894.
Now, if this was just a fleeting hallucination, you'd think Charlie would just wake up the next day and move on, right? But he doesn't. He commits. The very next day during his lunch hour, he goes to his bank and withdraws $300. That is nearly all the money he and his wife have. He takes this massive risk, goes to a coin dealer, and buys old-style currency at a premium. His $300 modern dollars yield less than 200 1894 bills, but he doesn't care. As he points out, eggs were only 13 cents a dozen back then. This action proves he is entirely, desperately committed to finding that third level again and making his escape permanent. So the crucial point is how this story shifts from a personal delusion to something much, much stranger, and it all hinges on Charlie's hobby, stamp collecting. We need to talk about a first-day cover. It's a well-known practice where, when a new stamp is issued, collectors buy it, stick it on a blank envelope, and mail it to themselves on the very first day of sale. The postmark proves the exact date the stamp was released. These envelopes are normally never opened, they just hold blank paper. Keep this concept in mind because it is about to turn Sam the psychiatrist's diagnosis completely on its head.
See, Charlie never actually manages to find the corridor to the third level again, despite searching every single weekend. He eventually gives up and goes back to his stamps. But one night, while fussing with his collection, he finds a first-day cover that absolutely should not be there. It's addressed to his grandfather in Galesburg, Illinois, and bears a postmark of July 18, 1894, stamped over a 6-cent dull brown picture of President Garfield. It had just been sitting in his grandfather's collection for decades, yet Charlie has no memory of it ever being there before. And unlike a normal first-day cover, this one is not empty.
Charlie opens the envelope, and instead of blank paper, he finds a letter written directly to him. The words are impossible. It reads, "I got to wishing that you were right. Then I got to believing you were right. And, Charlie, it's true. I found the third level." The letter goes on to describe that the writer has been in Galesburg for 2 weeks, listening to someone play the piano, singing songs on the porch, drinking lemonade. It urges Charlie and Louisa to keep looking until they find a third level, promising that it's worth it. Someone else actually found the exit.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate twist of the narrative. Who signed that impossible letter from 1894? It was Sam. Sam, Charlie's own psychiatrist. The exact same man who confidently diagnosed Charlie's experience as a waking dream wish fulfillment. Charlie goes to the coin store and discovers that Sam recently bought $800 worth of old-style currency. That's enough to set him up in the quiet hay, feed, and grain business he always dreamed of. It shows us just how infectious the desire for escapism really is. Sam couldn't go back to his old business of psychiatry in 1894 Galesburg, so he just stayed. The doctor literally succumbed to the very fantasy he diagnosed in his patient.
Which brings us to the final, lingering puzzle of this explainer. Are we seeing a literal intersection of time and space, a real portal that two men managed to walk through? Or is this just an elaborate projection, a shared, desperate delusion created by minds completely overwhelmed by modern stress? I mean, did Charlie imagine the letter to validate his own madness, or did Sam truly escape the fear and worry of the 20th century? The genius of Jack Finney's writing is that he gives you all the evidence, but he leaves that final diagnosis entirely up to you. So what do you think?
Welcome to This Explainer. I am so thrilled to take you through today's deep dive. We're stepping way back in time, right into the incredibly tense, high-stakes historical stage of World War II Japan. We're going to be looking at a truly powerful narrative crafted by Pearl S. Bruck called The Enemy. Let me tell you, it's an absolute masterclass in tension, asking what really happens when your deepest moral loyalties are pitted directly against each other.
To kick things off, I want you to put yourself in this exact scenario. Think about it. Should he save him as a doctor or hand him over to the army as a patriot? What would you do? It's the ultimate what would you do hook, right? And it plunges us directly into the profound ethical paradox at the very heart of this text. It's not just some theoretical question you ponder in a classroom. It is a sudden, visceral matter of life, death, and literal treason.
Okay, let's dive into Section 1, The Doctor and His Past, Building the World of Dr. Sadao Haki.
Before we can even begin to understand the chaos of his dilemma, we have to establish Sadao's perfectly ordered world. He lives a life built on rigid rules, steep traditions, and a very elite social status. His background is honestly exceptional. At just 22 years old, he was sent all the way to America to learn everything he possibly could about surgery and medicine. By the time he returns at age 30, he isn't just a surgeon. He's a famous scientist perfecting a major medical discovery to render wounds entirely clean. And in the present day of our story, well, he's so valuable that the Japanese military brass has kept him right there in Japan rather than sending him abroad with the troops. Why? Just in case the old general needs a life-saving operation.
But alongside that elite, Western-educated medical background, Sadao has an incredibly strict traditional foundation. You see, his father was deeply nationalistic. We're talking about a man who literally never joked with him, a man who saw the Southern Islands as the stepping stones to the future for Japan. Even Sadao's marriage to his wife Hana reflects all of this. Though they actually met by chance at an American professor's house, they waited to fall in love until he was absolutely sure she was Japanese. Their marriage was only approved by his father because she was of pure Japanese race. It's a fascinating juxtaposition, really. You have this American medical education operating strictly within the bounds of intense Japanese tradition.
Moving on to Section 2, A Body on the Beach. The anomaly arrives.
So, that quiet, highly structured coastal life, it's about to be violently interrupted. Sadao and Hana are just looking out into the cold sea fog when they spot a figure flung out of the ocean by a breaker. It's a battered man, staggering onto his hands and knees, his arms thrown up above his head before he completely collapses face down in the sand. Now at first, they naturally assume it's just a local fisherman washed from his boat. But as they rush down to the spiked coastal rocks, they make a pretty gruesome discovery. The man is completely unconscious, and more urgently, he is bleeding heavily from the right side of his lower back. Sadao's expert fingers quickly find an old gun wound, its flesh totally blackened with powder. Now notice what happens here. Sadao's immediate instinct is to pack that fearful, bleeding wound with the sea moss scattered right there on the beach. His deeply ingrained medical reflexes instantly take over to staunch the bleeding, way before his conscious mind even has time to process the sheer danger of the situation. Which brings us to Section 3, Identifying the Enemy, the Heavy Realization. The sea mist clears just enough. The wet cap falls away, and Hannah whispers in absolute horror, "A white man." They see his yellow hair and his rough yellow beard. Sadao looks closer at the battered cap, and the faint lettering spells out U.S. Navy. The horrifying truth just crashes over them. This unconscious, bleeding man is a sailor from an American warship. He's an escaped prisoner of war who was shot in the back. The enemy is literally bleeding out right on their doorstep.
Now for Section 4,
The ultimate moral dilemma, an impossible choice.
Our characters have suddenly arrived at a terrifying life-or-death crossroads, and there is absolutely no easy way out. Let's weigh these two impossible choices impartially for a second. On one hand, we've got Sadaw's duty to his country. If he turns this escaped prisoner over to the police, well, the man will certainly die. But on the other hand, we have his duty to his profession, his sworn oath to save lives. If he shelters a white man to heal him, it's a straight-up act of high treason. It would mean absolute danger and likely arrest for Sadaw, his wife, and his 2 young children.
Logically, they actually come up with a third option. The easiest, safest thing for their family would simply be to put him back into the sea and just let nature take its course. Both Sadaw and Hana verbally agree that this is the best, kindest course of action, but as they stand there over the inert figure, a curious repulsion keeps them completely frozen. Neither of them can bring themselves to actually throw a wounded man back into the deadly surf.
So they cross the point of no return. Together they lift his starved, feather-light body, carry him through the side door of their house, and place him on the deeply matted floor of an empty bedroom. But here is the profound irony of this exact moment. The room they place this filthy, bleeding American enemy into, it's the sacred, highly traditional bedroom of Sadaw's late father. The very man who was so strictly nationalistic, he wouldn't even sit in a foreign chair.
Next up, Section 5. Defying the servants, the household mutiny. By bringing the enemy inside, they trigger the final escalation of this conflict. The secret is out within the walls of the house, and the terrified servants absolutely refuse to help an enemy. The incredibly superstitious old gardener actually gives Hana a blunt warning. He says, "The white man ought to die. If the master heals what the gun did and what the sea did, they will take revenge on us." He genuinely believes that nature itself wants this man dead, and interfering is going to curse the entire household.
This mutiny really comes to a head with Yumi, the children's nanny. Even when commanded to bring hot water and wash the dirty, unconscious American, she stubbornly refuses to even touch him. Her sheer defiance forces Hana's hand. Hana is forced to wash the enemy herself, isolating the couple even further in their dangerous, treasonous decision. They are now entirely alone in this.
So the really crucial point here is the stark contrast between the servant's absolute panic and Sadaw's clinical, overriding determination. As Sadaw feels the faint pulse in the man's cold breast, he realizes the man is definitely going to die without an operation. Hana is terrified, asking, "What if he should live?" But Sadaw is already completely focused on the procedure, replying, "What if he should die?" Despite the immense risks to his family, his status, and his own life, the surgeon inside him is absolutely compelled to operate.
And this brings us right back to the ultimate question at the heart of this incredible explainer. If you were bounded by a fierce loyalty to your nation in a time of total war, but also bound by a sacred oath to heal and save lives, which would you betray? Think about what you would truly do if you were in Dr. Sadaw's place. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I'll leave you with that provocative thought to ponder.
Welcome to this explainer of Kalki's famous satirical tale, The Tiger King. Today, we're unpacking the dark comedy, the completely absurd narrative, and the profound ecological warnings hidden right beneath the surface, starting with its incredible twist ending. So let's just dive right into the central, wild question this entire story orbits around. How does a legendary Maharaja, a guy who supposedly conquered 99 mighty beasts with his own hands and guns, end up getting taken out by a cheap, wooden child's toy? Over the course of this explainer, we're going to see how dramatic irony and the blinding hubris of absolute power lead to the Maharaja's absurd demise. But first, let's rewind to his bizarre beginnings to understand exactly how this obsession started. The story actually kicks off at the very birth of the king of Pradipandhapuram. When he was born, the chief astrologers were immediately called in, and they made a pretty grave prophecy. They foretold that because the young prince was born in the astrological hour of the bull, his death would ultimately come from the bull's natural enemy. And what's that? A tiger. Now here is where Kalki injects sheer, brilliant absurdity right into the setup of the tale. In a comedic miracle, the 10-day-old infant suddenly spoke. He demanded to know the specific manner of his death from the astrologers. When they told him it would be a tiger, the baby didn't cry. Nope. Instead, he issued a chilling warning, squeaking out, "Let tigers beware." From there, the crown prince grew up exactly like other Indian royalty of that era, raised entirely in the English fashion. You know the drill. He drank the milk of an English cow, was tutored by an Englishman, watched English films. But when he finally took the throne at 20 years old, he remembered that dark prophecy from his infancy. To protect himself, he went straight out and killed his very first tiger, sparking a lifelong, deadly obsession. Thrilled with his first kill, the king showed the dead beast off to the chief astrologer. But the astrologer? He wasn't impressed at all. He laid down a massive challenge. He looked right at the king and said, "You might kill 99 tigers, but you must be very, very careful with the 100th tiger." In fact, the astrologer was so confident, he vowed that if the king killed 100 tigers, he would tear up all his astrology books, set them on fire, cut off his hair, and become an insurance agent. Okay, so the absolutely crucial takeaway here is how this personal obsession immediately hijacked the entire state. The Maharaja issued a royal decree making himself the sole predator in the kingdom. Tiger hunting was strictly banned for everyone else. If a peasant so much as dared to fling a stone at a tiger, all their wealth and property would be confiscated. The king effectively paused all actual governance, swearing he'd attend to state matters only after his tally reached 100. And this obsession almost cost him everything. At one point, a high-ranking British officer visited the state, wanting to hunt tigers, or, at least be photographed with a dead one. The Maharaja flatly refused. He offered him a boar hunt, or even a mosquito hunt instead. But to prevent the angry British officer from stripping him of his kingdom, the Maharaja had to bribe the officer's wife. He sent her 50 extremely expensive diamond rings, expecting her to just keep one or two. Well, she kept them all, sticking the king with a massive bill of 300,000 rupees. But to the king, holding on to his tiger monopoly was totally worth it. For a decade, the king's ruthless efficiency was unmatched. He successfully hunted down 70 tigers. But then, an unforeseen hurdle brought his mission to a screeching halt. He had completely wiped out the tiger population of the forests in Pratibandapuram. There were literally no tigers left to shoot. So how does he fix a tiger shortage? This builds into absolute comedy. He calls in his Diwan and demands a wife, but definitely not for love. He orders the Diwan to calculate tiger populations in neighboring states, find a royal family with a huge tiger reserve, and arrange a marriage with their princess. He quite literally married into more tigers, treating his poor father-in-law's kingdom as his own personal hunting ground, bagging 5 or 6 tigers every single time he visited his wife. The madness just continues to escalate. He finally reaches 99 tiger skins hanging on his wall. Just one left. But then, his father-in-law's forests run dry too. With that final tiger nowhere to be found, the Maharaja's anxiety reaches a fever pitch. He refuses to leave the forest, fires his officers in fits of rage, and even threatens to double the land tax out of pure spite, risking a full-on rebellion. At this point, the Diwan is terrified he's going to lose his job, or worse, cause a public revolt. So he comes up with a desperate, hilarious plan. He secretly procures a week-old, basically tame tiger from a public park in Madras, hides it in his house, and at midnight drags this poor beast into his car. He drives it out to the forest and practically pushes it right into the king's path. The very next day, this old tiger wanders up to the Maharaja and just stands there. The overjoyed king takes careful aim and fires. The beast collapses in a heap. The Maharaja is ecstatic. He thinks he's finally conquered his fate. He orders a grand procession for the dead beast and speeds off in his car. But he is completely unaware of what actually happened. Because right after the king leaves, his hunters go up to inspect the kill, and they realize the tiger is looking right back at them. The king had missed. The bullet just whizzed past, and the frail old tiger had simply fainted from the shock of the noise. Now the hunters are terrified. If they tell the king he missed, he'll fire them for sure. So, in an act of ultimate sycophancy, one of the hunters steps up and shoots the fainted tiger from a foot away. They bury it in a tomb, keeping the king completely in the dark. And this brings us to the core of the story, the ultimate dramatic irony. The king thinks he's cheated death. He thinks he has conquered nature itself. Relaxed, he finally turns his attention to his 3-year-old son. He goes to a shop and buys him a birthday gift, a cheap 2-anna wooden toy tiger. The shopkeeper overcharges him out of fear, but it's really just a roughly carved piece of junk. While playing with his son, the poor craftsmanship of the toy proves absolutely deadly. A tiny sliver of wood, standing up like a quill, pierces the Maharaja's right hand. He casually pulls it out and ignores it, but the next day, a massive infection flares up. In just 4 days, the infection develops into a deadly sore spreading all over his arm. 3 famous surgeons are rushed in from Madras to save him. They operate, and when they emerge from the operating theater, they deliver what has to be one of the most satirically absurd lines in literature. The operation was successful. The Maharaja is dead. It's successful because, well, medically they couldn't save him, but cosmically, the prophecy was fulfilled. The 100th tiger, albeit a wooden one, took its final revenge.
Power, hubris, and irony. Unpacking the satire. Let's shift gears for a minute and break down the deeper literary and societal messages Kalki embedded in this dark comedy. Because this isn't just a funny story about a king, it's a sharp, biting critique of power structures and human nature.
At the very heart of the mechanics of this story is dramatic irony. Now, dramatic irony is when we, the audience, know something crucial that the main character doesn't. We know he missed the 100th tiger, the hunters know it, but the king dies completely convinced that he won. This makes his death by a tiny wooden splinter brilliantly poetic and deeply ironic. He spent his entire life hunting fierce beasts to avoid his fate, only to be undone by a cheap piece of wood shaped exactly like his obsession.
Take a look at how his followers behave throughout this story. Are they loyal, sincere? Not at all. The Dewan plans a fake tiger. The hunters secretly shoot the tiger the king missed. The shopkeeper lies about the price of the toy tiger. Absolutely everyone manipulates the truth out of pure terror of the king's tyrannical, unchecked power. They're driven entirely by self-preservation.
And you know, this prompts a really vital question about our modern world, one the source material actively asks us to consider. How often do we see leaders today surrounded by yes-men? When power is absolute and the penalty for telling the truth is severe, people will always hide reality to protect their own positions. The story serves as a timeless warning about the isolating, reality-distorting nature of unchecked authority.
Furthermore, Kalki indirectly but fiercely critiques human callousness towards wildlife. In the story, animals aren't living, breathing creatures. They're treated as mere numbers on a tally sheet, trophies meant to stroke a fragile ego. The Maharaja treats the natural world as something that exists solely for his conquest, and this is highly relevant today. Modern game hunting by the wealthy directly mirrors the Maharaja's hubris, treating majestic wildlife as disposable props for vanity. We also get to see the terrifying scale of that destructive mindset. The Maharaja literally causes the deliberate extinction of tigers in 2 entire states just to satisfy his own pride. It's a stark, almost terrifying warning about human disruption of nature. When one person's ego is prioritized over an entire ecosystem, the whole system suffers.
As the source text highlights towards the end, we desperately need a new system for the age of ecology. We've got to move away from systems built on the exploitation of nature and the sycophancy of power. Instead, we need a system embedded in the care of all people, the earth, and all life upon it. We just can no longer afford the destructive conceit of those who think they can bend the laws of nature to their will.
I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder from today's explainer. In our modern pursuit to conquer nature, build our egos, and project absolute power, what seemingly harmless consequences, what tiny wooden tigers are we ignoring right now? While we're out hunting for massive, imaginary threats, we really must ask ourselves if the true danger is the small, sharp splinter of reality we're just too arrogant to notice. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep questioning the world around you.
All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring something incredibly powerful, how the collision between pure childhood innocence and harsh systemic prejudice actually plants the very first seeds of resistance. We are going to dig into 2 deeply moving autobiographical accounts that show us exactly what it feels like to hit those societal walls for the very first time. So, we're looking at 2 totally different worlds here. On the left, we have late 19th century America, seen through the eyes of Zikkalasa, a Native American girl sent to a boarding school. And on the right, we've got contemporary Tamil Nadu, India, experienced by Bama, a young Dalit girl navigating the complex caste system. But here's the thing, despite the massive cultural and historical gap between a Native American school and a bustling South Indian street, these 2 stories share a profoundly universal journey.
Which brings us to a fundamental question, right? What actually happens when a child's complete innocence just smashes into the reality of systemic prejudice? How does a kid process a world that suddenly turns around and tells them they're somehow lesser? That's exactly what we're unpacking today.
Section 1. Childhood in the margins. Let's quickly ground ourselves in the everyday experiences of these 2 children before everything changed.
For young Bama, the world was just this vibrant, chaotic, absolutely wonderful distraction. What should have been a quick 10-minute walk home from school would turn into a joyous hour-long adventure. Her streets were literally alive. I mean, think about it. Performing monkeys, a guy pedaling a bicycle for 3 days straight, huge temple bells ringing, a hunter gypsy walking around with a wild lemur, and waiters expertly cooling coffee in the local clubs. Her whole world was just tethered to curiosity and joy.
Now contrast that vivid joy with Sitka Saw's arrival in what she called the land of apples. It was an immediate, terrifying sensory overload. She was stripped of her soft moccasins and forced into these squeaking, stiff shoes that robbed her of her quiet step. She described the environment as a complete bedlam, loud metallic bells crashing into sensitive ears, and an undercurrent of voices murmuring in an entirely unknown language. A total physical shock to the system.
Section 2. A clash of cultures. This is where those innocent worlds directly collide with the cold, hard mechanisms of societal control.
At the Carlisle Indian School, Sitka Saw was subjected to this highly regimented, honestly kind of robotic, eating by formula. Step 1, a small bell is tapped, pull out your chair. Step 2, a second bell sounds, everyone sits. Step 3, a third bell is tapped, and you finally begin eating. For a child used to natural freedom, this perfectly highlights the pure absurdity of forced assimilation. She was so terrified and confused by these rigid rules that she actually ended up crawling back into her chair and crying, completely unable to play along with the charade.
Meanwhile, over in India, Bama's clash happens right out on her vibrant street. She spots a respected elder from her own community, bringing a food packet to a landlord. But notice how he's carrying it. He's dangling it humiliatingly by a single string, bowing low, terrified to actually touch the parcel. Through Bama's innocent eyes, she actually finds this comical at first. She literally wants to shriek with laughter at a grown man playing such a funny game, worried that the snacks might tumble out.
Section 3. The threat of erasure. Because as you'll see, the reality behind these moments is about to shift from confusing or comical to deeply threatening.
For Sitka Saw, her friend Judawin brings a terrifying warning. The pale-faced women are planning to cut their heavy hair. Now, this isn't just a haircut, okay? It's a devastating threat of erasure. In their culture, only unskilled, captured cowards or people in deep mourning wear short or shingled hair. This was a highly calculated move to literally strip away her identity and replace it with shame.
Back in Tamil Nadu, Bama's illusion is completely shattered by her older brother, Anand. He explains that the elder wasn't playing a game at all. He had to hold the package by a string because of untouchability. This is the cruel, systemic belief that his very touch, as a member of a marginalized Dalit community, would somehow pollute the upper caste landlord's food, even though the food was already wrapped in leaves and paper. Just heartbreaking.
Section 4. Awakening to Injustice. Finding out the brutal why behind all of this triggers a massive emotional awakening for both girls.
Faced with the horrifying prospect of losing her hair, Sitka Saw actually tries to escape the machine. She creeps upstairs into a dim room and hides under a bed, shivering with sheer terror in the dark. But the institution is relentless. She's hunted down, dragged out kicking and scratching, and tied fast to a chair. But right before she's captured, she tells her friend this incredibly powerful statement: "No, I will not submit. I will struggle first." And this is just brilliant because it shows her core agency. She's basically saying, no way, I am not going down without putting up an intense personal fight. She recognizes the injustice and chooses absolute defiance.
For Bama, that realization that her own people, fellow human beings, must fetch and carry for landlords who strip them of their dignity, turns her amusement into intense, burning anger. She wonders why her elders should shrink and bow to people who have lost all human feeling just because they scraped a few coins together. It's a profound reminder of how fast childhood innocence is replaced by righteous fury when you're slapped in the face with undeniable unfairness.
Section 5. The power of education. So how do they respond to being treated like little animals, driven by a herder, or expected to shrink and bow?
It raises the defining question of their childhoods. How do you fight back against a systemic, historical force that is just so much larger than yourself, especially when you're literally just a kid?
Bama's brother Anand gives her a real game-changer of an answer here. He tells her that while they might be stripped of honor by birth in this system, education and academic excellence are the tools to force society to respect them. He essentially says, work hard, stay ahead in your lessons, and people will have to come to you of their own accord.
Section 6. The Seeds of Rebellion. Let's look at how those painful early memories grew into something truly powerful.
We end up seeing two incredible triumphs. While Zitkala tragically felt her spirit break when the cold blades cut her thick braids, she absolutely did not stay silent. She grew up to relentlessly criticize and expose the evils of forced assimilation. And over on the right, Bama took her brother's words to heart. She channeled all that fierce anger into studying in an absolute frenzy. She stood first in her class, surrounded herself with friends, and eventually became a powerful writer.
So I want to leave you with this thought to mull over. Can injustice ever truly escape the notice of a child? As we've seen in this explainer, if the profound seeds of resistance are planted this early in life, it proves that kids are incredibly perceptive to the unfairness around them. And it's those raw early memories that powerfully shape the resilient adults who eventually rise up, challenge, and change the system. Thanks for exploring this with me today, and always keep questioning the world around you.
Welcome to today's explainer. We've got a really beautifully intricate topic lined up for you as we visually dissect a true literary classic. Together, we're going to break down Adrienne Rich's profound and heavily layered poem, Aunt Jennifer's Tigers. Now, it's a short poem, but as you'll see in just a minute, it packs a massive emotional punch. Right off the bat, I want you to think about this psychological paradox. How can a person who feels entirely trapped create something completely fearless? This right here is the central narrative tension of our entire explainer today. We're looking at an artist who creates these vibrant, powerful works of art while simultaneously living a life of quiet terror. Keep that paradox in the back of your mind as we move forward.
Section 1. The Feminist Voice. So, before we can truly understand the depths of the poem itself, we first need to understand the powerful voice behind it. Adrienne Rich, who was born in 1929 and passed away in 2012, wasn't just a poet. She was a major theorist and a highly prominent figure in the contemporary women's movement. Across 19 volumes of poetry and multiple collections of essays, her work consistently provided a strong resistance to things like racism and militarism. But crucially for what we're looking at today, her writing directly addresses the harsh realities and constraints of married life that women experienced during her time. So this isn't just a poem about tigers, right? It's a critique of patriarchal oppression.
Section 2. The Fearless Topaz Tigers.
We're to start by examining these bold creations, before we look at the creator herself. And I really want you to feel the energy in this first stanza. It moves. It has this sleek, confident rhythm. Aunt Jennifer's tigers prance across a screen, bright topaz denizens of a world of green. They do not fear the men beneath the tree. They pace in sleek, chivalric certainty. I mean, you can practically see that vibrant yellow-orange topaz color popping against a rich green background, just moving with absolute unbothered pride.
And you have to realize, these magnificent, prancing beasts we're talking about aren't wild animals out in the jungle. This is careful, deliberate needlework being stitched onto a screen or a panel by Aunt Jennifer herself. She is actively creating this world with her own hands.
What's absolutely crucial here is the specific vocabulary Rich chooses to describe these embroidered animals. She calls them denizens. That means they belong there. They're inhabitants who completely own their space, and they move with a sleek, elegant, chivalric certainty. It paints them as noble, honorable, and above all, they do not fear the men beneath the tree. They are the absolute masters of their domain.
Section 3. The Weight of the Ring.
Okay, so that energetic, confident tone we just experienced, it's about to drastically change. We go straight from the proud, prancing tigers to this. Aunt Jennifer's fingers, fluttering through her wool, find even the ivory needle hard to pull. The massive weight of Uncle's wedding band sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand. The pacing here is suddenly so much slower. It's heavy, it's somber. You can literally feel the physical exhaustion in the words. Her fingers aren't confident at all. They are fluttering, nervous, frail.
It's a completely stark contrast. Honestly, it's a bit jarring. On one side, we have the creator, Aunt Jennifer. She's terrified, her fingers flutter with anxiety, and she is weighed down by her circumstances. But then, on the other side, we have her creation, the tigers, prancing, proud, unafraid, full of certainty. So you have to ask yourself, why would a woman who is so worn down create art that is the exact opposite of her own terrifying, constrained reality? Well, it's because this bull tiger represents her psychological escape. It's an artistic projection of the absolute freedom, strength, and fearlessness that she entirely lacks in her day-to-day marriage. Where she is weighed down by Uncle's wedding band, the tigers get to roam free in their world of green. She is literally stitching the life she wishes she could live.
Section 4. Art outlives the artist.
And this brings us into the poem's conclusion, which is incredibly tragic, yet undeniably profound. Just listen to the haunting finality of this third stanza. When Aunt is dead, her terrified hands will lie, still ringed with ordeals she was mastered by. The tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing, proud and unafraid. Even in death, the terror doesn't leave her hands. It's just a devastating image of a life completely consumed by fear.
So, let's play detective here for a minute. The text asks us to consider, what exactly are these ordeals she's surrounded by? And look very, very closely at Rich's deliberate wordplay with the word ringed. What's the double meaning going on there?
This is the true aha moment of the poem. The word ringed functions on two entirely different levels. In a strictly literal sense, her dead hands are physically wearing Uncle's heavy wedding band, right? She is literally ringed by a piece of jewelry. But the figurative meaning is much, much darker. To be ringed also means to be surrounded, trapped, and, as the poem explicitly says, mastered by the oppressive constraints and ordeals of her marriage. That wedding ring transforms from a simple symbol of union into a massive, inescapable shackle of patriarchal control.
And that leaves us with our core takeaway, the ultimate contrast: mortal oppression versus immortal art. Aunt Jennifer is physically defeated by the heavy, terrifying constraints of her life. She literally dies with terrified hands. But the tigers she made, her spirit, her inner desires, her vision of absolute freedom, those are going to go on prancing across that panel forever. Her art achieves the immortality and the fearlessness that she never, ever could in her waking life. I want to wrap up our explainer today by leaving you with a direct, thought-provoking question drawn straight from the text. Do you sympathize with Aunt Jennifer? And furthermore, what do you think the attitude of the speaker actually is towards her? Is it just pity, or is it admiration for her quiet rebellion? When you look at the incredible legacy she left behind in those stitches, ask yourself how her silent struggle echoes in the world today. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and I'll see you in the next explainer.